The world, where a barren land is about to be deprived and the sky is destroyed in a rich one of hopes and possibilities, seems to be an endlessly inhabited land where all evils can become reality. Heaven is the place of the world of absolutely skinned people, a symbol of endless possibilities and hopes, emphasizing the pursuit of life until the end of life, until freedom, before finding your way in the midst of endless expanses. But in order to reach this world, how many people have said goodbye to their lives, giving everything for the sake of the goal? Their victims are deprived of the unknown, and their suffering is often not be evaluated. The eyes of the main character, named Zeke, which were straight up the mountain, shone with the unchanging blue of the sky, boundless and deep, silent, the boundless ocean. The endless sky that leads to paradise, covered with 9 layers of gloom, the skin of which welcomes new secrets and testing. The one who ascends to heaven and passes through all 9 clouds will become a giver of light, denying not only boundless power, but also access to knowledge that will change the very essence of life. Here are the songs of singing that I myself will become a volunteer to the world, and of renewed courage, having sent my difficult journey to the skies. It all started in a small place where students competed with the competitors. With wide grins on their faces, the stinks handed out brochures, asking participants and guests to watch for the arrival of their heroes. 3 boys showed up hesitantly, their looks making the students anxious and declaring that they had prepared everything perfectly. One of them, expressing his sensitivity to publicity, took the brochure she was handing out from the student. There's nothing special about it, just the bliss of flying into the sky, even at the cost of living, having said it and started tearing up brochures in front of everyone. Then all 3 of them burst out laughing at the top of their voices, not even noticing that Zik was standing in charge. Zik, with a slight laugh at his appearance, may have quietly crept up and snatched money from under their noses. One of them immediately noticed how he sniffed the little bag and was clearly pleased with such humility. Zik chuckled, yapped for pennies, and chantedly declared that he knew where to stop. The contestants fell wildly, not believing their eyes, and even could not understand how he had managed to rob them so cunningly and inconspicuously. After this, the militia rushed after him, reporting that they were trying to catch everyone. The lad quickly rushing forward with incredible speed and knocking down everyone who was on his way. He quickly ran up to the man standing at the front and unceremoniously tossed his box of speeches, scattering them all over. Then, without reducing fluidity, he sharply cut through the girl, who stumbled on her way, not giving her a chance to react. The prot contestants did not hesitate and did not step back, lightly continuing the pursuit, trying in any way to catch up with him. One of the interrogators was already very close, and stretching out his hand, almost bumped into Zika, ready to bury him. He realizes that his axis is caught, and he turns around, feeling how his heart speeds up the rhythm, after which Zeke gave a strong kick to the competitor's stomach, using all his strength and speed. Having caught up with another participant, he immediately rushed up and immediately began to earnestly prepare for the blow. Zeke quickly pulled out some jelly powder, and without hesitation threw it in the eyes, thereby blinding the enemy, after which all the competitors immediately felt satisfied with their catch. Raptum, I sense the presence behind me, and immediately Zikamyanov is in place. Before Zik could come to his senses, the 3rd contestant appeared in front of him, who, without worrying, had buried him for the world. Having paid a lot of money for the joke, the contestant grinned and said that in this there are only 2 steps to the development of the idea. Either the stink will simply kill him, or Zik will turn back everything he has taken, and then with their only method will beat him to death. Instead of submitting to the threats, he reluctantly called him out on such a reaction. After this, Zik rudely sent him away, and then laughed. Nothing happened. His denunciation expressed renewed vigor. Without giving any meaning, they continued to behave calmly and serenely. Their opponents were incredibly angry. Their eyes burned with anger, and veins popped up all over their bodies, their noses vibrating with rage. You signed a deadly sign for yourself. After washing the wine, you forcefully threw Zik on the ground. With a distorted look, he rushed at him with all his strength, throwing one blow after another, not giving a blow. For a decade, Zik was already completely covered with scars and blues, revealing disheveled clothes, and blood flowed from his nose in a thin stream. His skin began to grow more and more important. His breathing became more and more urgent and important. Above him stood 3 embittered competitors, sharpened from different sides, and one of them, without ceasing to throw blows, lowering his fist again and again. "Did you think, what am I frying? after washing the wine and starting to reach for the pennies with his hand as if he had stolen Zeke. However, Zeke stood up with a rapt roar, escaped with incredible fluidity and saved up the pennies, and there was such inconsistency that his rivals were not able to react. His gaze became stony, his teeth clenched, and he washed away that he could not let them in. I, with confidence, with a firm voice, humming loudly, said that the usual circumstances would not give them away, no matter what kind of screams I happened to have to pay off. These words angered the contestant even more, and he annoyed him by declaring that Zikov would immediately understand that he himself had stolen them. All three of them pounced on Zik, throwing blows at them, and quickly gathered around them, but people were still on guard for what was happening, without hesitating every attempt to help and stop them. No one was trying to rub it in, even though Zik had a reputation as a known theft. Now appreciating, and now at the same time turning to grief, people have already risen to such an extent and respected that he deserved it. For an hour, Zik did not take away the numerical blows to the indictment, putting him on the line between the loss of information. In the middle of the crowd, a booming and decisive voice burst out. A tall, dark-haired lad, who appeared among the others, shouted so that they began to kick. "Who else is this?" with a smile in his voice, asking one of the contestants. The tall, dark-haired lad stood there, not seeing a word, but people from the crowd began to recognize him, so-called Mr. Freed, but no one could understand what brought him here. Mr. Freed turned his gaze to Zeke, looking at him respectfully, exposing him to injury. When their eyes shifted, Zik tensed up and squeezed his little balls even more tightly, his palates perceiving that there was only one support for him at this moment. Mr. Fred calmly stood up for Zik's work, singing to those present that he especially wanted to pay compensation for the damage caused or regulate the situation. However, the weariness of the Vin, angry with groans, is to let him go and study, hoping for understanding and attentive punishment for his actions. However, without asking for any compensation, they turned around in anger and without saying a word, went away, leaving Zika and Mr. Freed in the middle of the crowd. Sometimes Zik, sleeping on the ground, lying on the ground, and Fred stood by the guard and simply watched, not to worry about the thirsty ruin. The girls marveled at him, not knowing at all what to say to him at this moment. The words came out, could not change the situation, and most of the attempts at encouragement were powerless. Quietly dying and suddenly dying, Zik dared to look at him, and quickly recognized in his eyes the familiar face that cried out to him with alarm. The evening came, and the stench was lost in two, bleakly dark. The silence that fell around was deep and incredibly important, reminiscent of a calm yet oppressive mood. Freed chuckled at Zika's figure, and even sat there, concentrating on his thoughts, not expressing either word or gesture. "How can I be okay?" with an incredulous look, no images confirming Zeke. In the beginning of the reconciliation, which could have gotten out of the situation on its own, Alfred, they grinned, having washed that they had already killed him. Out of obvious disappointment, realizing that Freed didn't understand anything, at that moment a server flew out of her nose. After which he lifted the little bags, stole them, and admired them respectfully. "These are small grains. For such speeches you can give everything for the rest of your life, after washing them into the small bag of Zik." Freed chuckled, wondering that Zik had lost the way he used to be, always teetering between extremes. "At our first sustria, you stole my bread and didn't even get drunk at the age of 18 rocks. We are now in need, having washed fried." Frid, having respected Zik, was an incredibly good little stealer, whose decisiveness and intimacy managed to bring down hostility on those who were not so smart before being buried. It is possible and try to make amends, lest they burn out without being like everyone else. Especially from childhood, I remember the sparkle in the eyes of Zik, who had always expressed boundless determination and passion to the great mark, something special that did not deprive the others, and to carry on through the fates, this time deprived of life from Yogo memory. To tell the story of the tenacious lives of stealing, he was able to preserve hope, and even so his eyes were shining. They reflected not only the dark moments of the past, but also the inner strength, the unshakable faith in the ability to change one's life. Having sighed and laughed, Fred said that we couldn't understand how they had begun to make friends with him. His words were like a lightness, as neither of them marveled at the choice of power, but at whose look was greater. Without thinking too long, Zeke Verdov, that he also stole, his words were simple, but with a hint of irony, no matter how important. Taking a pause, Fred confirmed that in this world, no one can live in this place. His words sounded important, like an irrevocable fact that cannot be changed. And those who beat Zeke, those who guarded both sides, all of them are stealing. All of them are violating the rules of this world, taking away those who belong to others, either physically or morally. Remember Fred, such a stealer, even though everyone is trying to ascend to heaven like everyone else, he walks up to the best of his ability, not hesitating in the face of difficulties and sacrifices. Alazik interrupted his promontory, no longer afraid to hear any more, and rose sharply to his feet, making it clear that there was no longer any chance of our intention to lose our place. Fried chuckled at where Zik himself was going to go, trying to understand what the next stage of this situation was. Looking around, Zik marveled at Fried with a singing look, in which determination and strength stood out, whose eyes conveyed the very stubbornness with which he went about his own way, regardless of all the difficulties. Viprobhuvanya. To heaven, having washed the wine, raising your head to the mountain. At first, Fried was happy with this kind of reaction, but later a smile from his exposure gradually appeared. Once he realized that the situation could be more complex, it was not given to the first glance. I still can't comprehend how long ago the Stinks became the guarantors of such a lot, which invisibly wove their lives into an untransmitted web. The earth is deep and dead. What was wrong with this world? Since that moment everything collapsed, and the sky was divided into 9 levels. 500 years have already passed. Poverty, which irritably plagued every person, became the main cause of their suffering and waste, gradually taking away hope as soon as possible. At the same hour, hope on the brightest day, which was lost in the depths of the soul, still did not allow the anger to completely fade away before the change, as if it seemed that the dark was burying everything. It was there that the incredible hunger disappeared, and the sad sorrows of people who were struggling with all the difficulties of life became an invisible part of their pained suffering, like the unceasing crying of souls that could not find a way out of this hell. There, dreams fell apart about the brighter days of the future, which gave people hope and strength, recreating in the shadows of the past, which mercilessly dissipated in the harsh reality. But the only hope for a better life was to go to heaven, where it seemed all the worlds and forgotten thoughts about calm and harmony could end. Reaching to the very top, to the heavens, to the tree that rose to the heights, where the earth was angry with the sky, became not just death, but the desire for everything that could give evidence for all the unreasonable nourishment of life. To go through those paths, difficulties, and experiences that have become a sign of skin success and damage, in order to finally taste the fruits of life at this moment, when all the suffering and struggle become their own sword. More and more on the same path of her life, her destiny is destined. Fried smacked her head and sighed deeply, realizing the complexity of the situation, which was becoming increasingly lost in the skin. Even for them, this approach was exhilarating, as the situation seemed impossible in their minds, which was too difficult and hopeless. People who do not have the strength to reach the heavens will be deprived of the blessings of the future, in which there is hope and possibility. Do you even know how anyone else is? Following Frid after Zik. About an hour later, the contestants began to gather in the center of the place. Once all the contestants have gathered, the host starts the ceremony and welcomes them. The entry for which you came together will end right away, having washed the wine with a laugh at the accusation. He immediately shouted loudly, and with an unsatisfied fist, ended the ceremony, attracting the respect of all those present. This is Zik, who without hesitation loudly declared that he also deserved to take his fate. People with obvious wonder and storminess looked at him, reacting militarily, screaming that he was stealing the place, and began to discuss his issues loudly and disrespectfully. The mood suddenly changed dramatically. Comments and laughter filled the space. The atmosphere was filled with tension and confusion. Zik, under such pressure, managed to streamline his emotions, trying not to get angry and not give free rein to his disappointment and anger. Like a raptum, they sharply hit him on the shoulder, and grinning, greeting him, turned around in surprise. This is the leader, who began to rub his hands, looking satisfied, and with a grin on his face, having said that the skin has the ability to take part in his approach, regardless of the surroundings. His appearance changed sharply, becoming more angry, and his aura filled with tension, realizing that the fate of the exit is possible only after paying the fee. Zik, gritting his teeth in irritation, quickly pulled out the sacks from the intestines, and without saying a word, sharply stretched them to the leader, looking forward to the further steps. After this, the presenter began to chant, saying that now no one could be warned against Zik's participation in the entry, saying that he had already completed his readiness. Zika was amazed at the pleased smile of the leader, who took away the bags of grains from him, Provon Rozumiv, so that you won't waste anything. Even everything you need to do at once to get rid of the headache. Having left the lake, a picture of a burning place flares up before my eyes, filled with the screams and chaos of people who are trying to flow out of the imminent ruin, and the world is wondering about the exit from them, collapses. After attacking his place, the evildoers came to take away everything that was left of him, so that all of them were pennies. Little Zik was in the throes of hysteria, filled with fear and panic, when his father, with trembling in his eyes, gave him one small grain of grain, leaving no hope for the order of this merciless world. Therefore father ordered Zika to run away, hiding himself from the evildoer who rushed at them out of cruelty without giving up. He escaped with a cry and tears, his heart beating in fear and pain, feeling behind him the screams of his father who had killed that villain. Therefore, based on his determination and inner strength, Zik is determined to rise to the skies and achieve his destiny, not caring about everyday obstacles that might otherwise be on his way. This world is absolutely out of our minds, holding that very grain of grain in our hands, thinking to ourselves, and we will have to climb to the very top, going through all the troubles and difficulties, in order to defeat those who seemed impossible. The trembles began to rumble loudly, and this powerful sound reverberated through the crowd, attracting the respect of all those present. The leader of the area began to stun the head festival of heaven. The tense silence that had been panting before the Sims swelled with vigor, darkening the entire world, preparing to the point that the Axel would barely wake up. Leading with a sharp hand, he pointed to the forest, which had grown out of the order from them. After this, the leader of the region, having expressed his preference first for the contestants, first tries to know his bird of the soul. So in order to rise into the heavens, you need to catch the bird of the soul. This time I'll definitely hit it, Zik thought to himself. How many times have I been absolutely convinced that it is obligatory to change my share, realizing the new strength and decisiveness? The chaos began, all the contestants scattered in all directions. At that hour the birds marveled at them as if they were in comas. He rushed forward, hit one of the birds, and began to quickly run after it, trying to catch it. The birds moved swiftly forward, steadily licking from under Zika's hands, but not caring about everything. Every time, when he was close, the birds moved even further away. At the end of the day, the bird flew up the mountain, rising all the way to the sky, leaving Zika far behind, looking at the back of the bag, and buried. He slumped, trying to breathe out, desperately dying after the desperate chase, feeling how his heart beats in his chest, and his skin becomes more and more important. Ali Zik, not wanting to give up, having known other birds, rushed into the chase again, expressing new enthusiasm and courage. Having continued to run after the birds, you try with all your might to get them to fly up the mountain at the same time with him. But after 3 years, his enthusiasm began to fade away, all sleepiness and exhaustion, and he began to feel that his strength was leaving him. He began to scream loudly, but he didn't understand why everyone was so upset. This is yet another proof that you are weak. Having washed the cold voice behind Zik, his words pierced the silence, shaking the boy's heart. Having looked around, and having seen in front of him these very same competitors who had previously given him defeats, in their hands and in charge of them were birds, which gave them a mysterious and at the same time great look. Zik wrapped him from anxiety and anxiety, having recognized 3 people who at one time gave him painful lesions, degrading him both physically and morally. Oh, 3 brothers are badass? Having washed the wine and made the contestants angry. Without wanting to waste your precious time on them, it would be good to let them crash into the heavens, since they are so hungry for fame. I'm busy, so I'll go. I sighed and turned around, watching Zik. Those 3 contestants didn't think of just letting him go, even though their pride and vengeance necessitated unwholesome actions. Rampantly, one of them uncontrollably attacked Zika, Prot. Due to his quick reaction, he managed to dodge the blow, having avoided direct attack. Having gathered to the side, he turned around sharply and asked what was happening, and why he was attacking from behind, without the slightest courage to meet him face to face. One of the contestants, with an ironic smile in his face, believes that Zik seems to be clearly happy right from the start, even though everything is going so well that he doesn't want to go straight to new inconveniences. But this time it seems there was no one for him who could intercede in the face of his own difficulties, and all hopes for help were dashed. Virodki! Gritting his teeth, he said to Zik with conspicuous anger, his voice filled with hatred. With evil ridicule at the faces of the contestants, they came to Zeke, encouraging him to play with them for a few minutes, knowing that he could fit in their cruel minds. After this, their birds began to exert intense energy, giving the contestants incredible strength. In one of the contestants, victorious and the power of the bird, a powerfully sharp sword appeared, the enemy artifact revealed a careless glare, and its form was completely perfect. And in another contestant, a great deal of juice appeared. She beat the light, reinforcing the seriousness of his intentions and the need to take revenge on Zeke. After this, armed with their heavy armor, the two stinkers irresponsibly attacked Zeke from both sides, silent wild animals, ready for the rest of the battle. Unfazed by the raptness and severity of the attack, Zeke quickly reacted, and having gathered all his strength, was able to block the blow and sneak away. However, regardless of Bliskovich's reaction, one of the contestants still decided to seal his hand with his important sword. A forest of frozen ice hit his hands, leaving a slight wound, but there was enough ice to knock Zeke out of the water for a few seconds, but still he could be cut off. This dhyana became important, the heart beat in the breasts of our mother, in the place where the juice covered her hand, and the blood began to drain with a thin stream. "It's all over for you," having washed Zeke out of rage. His eyes burned with determination, clenching his fists and starting to attack the contestant, only to laugh. "What's the use of Rahunok?" The contestant threw out his ridicule and hostility. His eyes sparkled with evil, and his smile spread across his face. Before the blow, the contestant raptly came from the field to Zika's gaze, having otherwise disobeyed the wind. He took a deep breath for a second, trying to figure out where he was going. Turning around, he chuckled in wonder as the contestants rushed into the sky above him. He tensed up and watched in wonder as the stinks flew like rapt right in front of him, settling near the mountain, feeling like he had been ruined and not having any desire to work further. In their hearts, with satisfaction and mockery, the contestants marveled at Zeke, realizing that he had eaten the shepherd. "Vlashtuyemo Yoma!" the stinks screamed and quickly began to fly straight towards him. Zeke suddenly rushed into a run. His heart was beating faster than ever, and the contestants, without hesitation, rushed after him, trying to run over him and avoid a blow at any moment. With a loud cry, he quickly rushed towards the depths of the forest, tearing apart the silence, trying to escape from the interrogators who were approaching with a skin rash. Running forward, Zeke drove himself into the pasture and reached a remote corner where there was no possibility of continuing the walk, and sharply stumbled, realizing that he had stumbled in hopelessness. Alas, without realizing it, one of the contestants suddenly rushed into the attack from behind, trying to grab him by the hand, not giving him a chance to escape. With his magic, the contestant gave a hard blow to Zeke's stomach, and he felt the cold pain pierce his body, threatening to breathe. With such a forceful blow, Zeke flew several meters and fell to the ground, going into shock. "You are the only one left without a bird," the contestant said with ridicule and anger. The competitors continued to worry about him, in equal measure with the pitiful lump, destined to roam the earth, not looming any chance for a fight. Zik can no longer tolerate their distress, and having gathered all his power, decided to order them to lock themselves up. With pride in his voice, he boldly declared that he would immediately ascend to heaven, no matter what. However, the contestants laughed sarcastically at his words, saying that he was too weak to do what they were talking about. The stench began to sing, so that for someone like him to be spared, a miracle must be performed, but it is absolutely impossible. At this point, Zeke laughed, and having gathered his remaining strength, began to rise to his feet, not caring about the pain. "Do you really think that going up to heaven is my ultimate goal?" Having filled the veins with wonder, his voice is not an internal song. I'm not sure about the reaction, since they calmly responded and didn't succumb to their provocations, shocked the contestants and made them feel angry, even though they didn't feel such courage and pressure on his side. Zeke, unfazed by all the troubles and ill will on the side of the Supernicks, firmly determined to rise higher, reaching the 9 levels, knowing that only through resilience we can solve all the difficulties. After he loudly howled that he would rise to the very paradise, his words mooned like a curse to himself, inspired by the courage and invincible faith in his destiny. First, Zeke's words reverberated among the contestants. The stench did not smell as great as anyone else. After this competition, the competitors laughed, not letting out their laughter, not respecting its tightness and faith in the possibility of achieving the unattainable. "Do you want to understand what you are saying?" causing one of the contestants to laugh out loud. In all 500 rocks, no one has been able to rise to heaven itself, even though it was absolutely impossible, and all attempts have no small chance of success. And if you believe the ancient legends about paradise, then there is a place of life there, entrusting the tree of such great growth to the world, which is a symbol of immortality and harmony. After this competition, the competitors were filled with anger again, torn by their innocence and stubbornness. Don't you really want to become a ruler, a god? I filled one of them with renewed anger, not absorbing my hatred. With renewed hatred in his eyes, he washed it away with cold decisiveness, and his voice was filled with invincible joy. One of the contestants began to show his anger, and with ironic anger said that Zik made him laugh. After this, the participant raised his head with his arms high above his head, and the rape juice increased in size, becoming even more dangerous and powerful. After this, having made a strong swing, the contestant hit Zik in the stomach with all his might, and he winced in pain, squeezing the ice with jealousy. Rivers of blood began to flow from Zik's body, his eyes sank in pain, and having spent his strength he fell powerlessly to the ground, unable to rise. Ideally, death awaits him. Marveling at him, the contestants said. Their voices were filled with cruelty and cruelty. The stench continued to gawk at him. Apparently, if he had completely lost his sweetness, his body could no longer be heard, and his words sounded like the rest of a Virok. Zika had tears in his eyes. He couldn't believe that the death was so senseless and unfair, depriving everyone of their peace and hope in the past. His body was weakened, and his mind was overcome by bitterness, and as a result, he had not yet achieved anything, could not retire from his duties, and deprived this world without a hard fight. I also want to catch the bird, he thought bitterly and tearfully to himself. Zika's gaze suddenly fixed on the top of the mountain, noticing a great egg that was beginning to break. After whose egg rolled down like a rhabdo, gaining fluidity and straightening straight to them, no one could understand what was happening, and everyone was caught in surprise. The wrapped egg cracked, and a small penguin jumped out of it, greeting loudly, with a bright look, and cheerfully waving its paws, silently already ready for new arrivals. They were all caught in their tracks, their heads staring at the little penguin standing in front of them, noticing their importance, and looking with slight trepidation at everyone present. Their faces seemed outwardly unreasonable, and silence fell in the air, as if no one could explain what had happened. "Why did you wake us up?" marveled at Zika after washing the penguin. After which the penguin declared with renewed vigor that he would not give up his body by stumbling through his body. Having finished this picture, the contestants could not stop laughing, and began to feel mercilessly, both from the penguin and from Zeke himself, their laughter mooned, filled with ignorantness and cruelty. The Stinks respected this picture quite richly, enjoying each moment, until the ignorance further enhanced their achievements. In my opinion, this German bird and Zeke, who ideally suits her, are the same mirrors of one another, and even offended by the same volatile and weak. The contestant asked with a sneer that the bird really came to help Zeke, and there was obvious irony in his voice. No one could believe such nonsense. Penguin looked at Zeke, who was frozen and drenched in blood, and then sighed deeply, mutely understanding that his help might be too late. Zeke, the ice is very clear, with difficulty lifting his three-armed hand and stretching it to the penguin, trying to reach him in the hope of help. "Help me!" the two speakers, having washed Zeke, whose voice was weak, and my eyes were seeing, having already lost hope, and still struggling for the remaining ability. The penguin became angry with Zeke, and even respected him in an unacceptable way, so that he was poked with his chest hands, his eyes burned with anger, and he quickly dried up and looked at Zik with dissatisfaction. With even greater contemptuous anger, the penguin looked at the contestants. His gaze was filled with hatred to the point of cruelty, and he was ready to speak out against them. At that hour, the contestants continued to laugh, not understanding why the penguin was so angry and disrespectful at them. They respected him with a wonderful comical post, not suspecting that he could be more serious no matter what. Showed. Penguin marveled at them with such a look, considering them extremely unacceptable and annoying. After he got cold feet, the penguin decided to make accusations and help Zeke, although his heart was completely uneasy. However, the penguin chuckled slyly, thirsting for it so that it would not forget to give you a hug in exchange for help. Looking angry at the penguin's gaze, he was afraid to realize that he might ask for help. His heart began to beat faster, even thinking that in exchange for helping him, he would be victorious. Before he could react, as the penguin began to envelop him with its dark energy, the shadows that emerged from him buried Zeke. Having finished, the contestants were in complete shock and could not believe their eyes. They were caught in the act, not knowing whether it was reality or just a nightmare, because in their most terrible manifestations there was no place for such a thing. The energy of the penguin was so abundant that it burned everything that was in hand, leaving an excessive expanse of darkness. Energy wrapped itself around Zik's entire body, tightening him in its darkness. After this, the energy began to lift Zik high above the ground, and the contestants, dumbfounded, could not understand that they themselves were competing with him. They could not understand how out of all the possible options, Penguin, absolutely seriously, was able to choose someone who might have failed. After this, the burning of the fire, the stench was simply going to wake him up, not giving him any chance to fight. The stinks immediately began to attack Zeke and the penguin, trying to kill them. Penguin was happy, but they thought twice that they could run into him. His look was full of irony and contempt, and he understood perfectly well that at the same time the stench had no small chance against his strength. After this, the dark energy began to grow loudly and violently, gaining dangerous strength behind the skin. In the face of such a hostile species, the contestants were left speechless, having lost all time to think and not knowing what happened next. "But if I want 1,000, I can't beat everyone," he said loudly, his voice sounding cold and decisive, dumb. He was ready to kill any number of opponents without any doubts. A black dragon appeared in front of the contestants, a creation with the dark energy of a penguin, which wrapped itself around everything to a great extent, filling it with a fearful aura. The stench, at its core, was in complete shock, unable to comprehend as it might have sunk. Their eyes were wide open, and their thoughts were beating, even though there was a force in front of them, because of which the stench could not do anything. And standing in front of him was not just a little penguin, but a full-fledged, majestic black dragon, whose dark wings were straightening and his eyes were blazing with fire, terribly aware of how the earth beneath them was beginning to tremble under his power. Through the dark energy that surrounded Zika, we realize that we can now control this black dragon, which is crumbling under his control. He lightly lifted one hand, swayed at his position, the wind changed direction, and the ground shook under his feet, confirming his new control over the situation. Having finished, the contestants fell into an even greater shock. Their faces paled, and their minds could not grasp what was happening, and even everything they knew up to that moment changed rapidly. However, having realized how dangerous the situation was, the stinks immediately left the place and began to flow rapidly. Alazik had already begun to attack them, raising his hand and swinging at them. His hands were swift and decisive, confirming that he would not hesitate until he reached his mark. Having given a forceful blow to the ground, the vigorous hand of the dragon created a strong vibration that shook the earth and filled the space around it. After this, having given another blow to the place, the contestants stood peacefully, and the ground began to tremble under their feet. The competitors began to rush forward, looking back in panic, while the dragon's hand inevitably tried to attack them, blowing up the winds and leaving behind them a destructive force. Having realized that they were wasting a valuable hour, they began to grow and began to fight against the dragon's hand, trying to resist its attacks. "I don't believe it," I thought to myself, one of them. No matter how much the stench tried to fight off the dragon's hand, it was significantly stronger and disappeared from the earth. The dragon's hand began to cruelly drag them along the walls of the mountain, smashing them on the stone surface and incessantly unbearable pain. A bunch of hulls stood until the stone began to crumble under the weight and force of the blows. The earth shook, and the pill fell, hoping that there would be a crash. Then a saw curtain appeared around them, which obscured everything, creating a thick darkness in which only a slight sound could be made, and the crack of broken stones that scattered from the blows. When the saw curtain opened, there lay a lot of scattered stones and unseen contestants lying on top. The competitors died, were seriously injured, and simply lay on the ground, unable to collapse. The dark power of the penguin began to gradually lower Zeke to the ground, whose body became important under the influence of an invisible tractor, and when he realized that his skin was growing stronger, the dumb energy deprived him. Once again, you were in complete shock and began to come to your senses, your mind gradually turning to reality, and your body, wanting and importantly, began to respond to your commands again without regaining control over the situation. Having digested what has happened, I feel that the reality is finally becoming more apparent. Then, noting that there were wounds on his body, leaving him without any traces of injury, there were none of them. "How are you?" proudly marveling at Zik, asking the penguin. Penguin checked when Zik continued to shout about him and glorify him, but he could not understand any words. At the time of overflowing with emotions, even when the great peace had arrived, the hostiles were mixed with a sense of excitement, and even until now I could not believe that at this moment the time had come. Nareshti, having washed Zik with threefold hands, his voice was weak, but in the new one there was a lattice of hope. He was incredibly happy that he found his bird, but the penguin didn't know what to talk about. Zik, without suppressing his emotions, rushed to hug the penguin with tears in his eyes, renewed happiness and joy, and even more reason, which this little creature itself gave him a chance to recover. Penguin, mercilessly, began to wriggle from his arms, unnaturally kicking his paws in the guise of Zika, whose little body was convulsed in panic, and even though he was not at all ready for such manifestations of emotions, and just jumped to escape. But this very penguin, despite all its savagery and on the contrary, was the very key to the present world of Zika, whose little but incredibly heavy sleep became this rank, which opened the crooked paths to invisible. This very chance, for which, having looked through his entire life, the unique possibility of deciding to rise to the skies and achieve something that had died long ago, when he sensed that a new stage was dawning, his heart ached, I rejoice and praise. At that hour the forest was roaming, grieving everything around the oppressive, perhaps surprisingly quiet, and in the middle stood Freed calmly. "Do you think I'm late?" Confused and disappointed, having washed the wine, his voice is mooning, my shadow is in this dead, calm forest. Like a raptor, sensing strange sounds, and turning his side gaze to the light, as if he was making his way through the thick trees, creating glimpses on the surface of the earth, whatever was approaching, destroying the silence of the forest. "I've been waiting for you," a voice from a wondrous light whose tone was soft, but suddenly with an overwhelming force, never seemed to light up its powerful will. The light was already approaching and approaching, filling the forest with a warm golden hue, and Freed, filled with wonder and anxiety, could not understand what was happening. From the depths of the forest a very beautiful phoenix flies from the depths of the forest, its bright plumage paling with all its colors as the sun sets. This light filled the entire expanse, blinding with its light and creating the illusion of thoroughness. Otherwise this light itself could cleanse everything completely, take away the value and insignificance, giving seemingly absolute harmony. Phoenix came closer to Freed, but overcome with emotions, he could not even look at him. "You would immediately become the ruler of heaven, having promoted Frida." At that hour, Zik could not control his emotions and continued to live for the fact that a bird had appeared in a new situation. His heart felt a sense of happiness and relief, and then this little thing became his reason, darkness and hopelessness. After that you cackled like the name of the penguin, but there was no name because only people were born today. Then your name will be Grumpy because you are constantly muttering, having said Zik with a broad laugh. Penguin was not satisfied with this name, and asked him to guess something different, more original, so that it would better reflect his character and likeness. That Zik didn't feel the fuss, and continued to feel glad that he had found a companion, and urged him to go on the road as soon as possible. Penguin was simply shocked by such impudent behavior. He opened his veins, hitting Zik in the arms, trying to get rid of him and let him go to himself, realizing that he was becoming less and less comfortable. After that, he descended to the ground and began to say that Zik began to think that he would not be able to hear anything, and even if the penguin was not at all able to adapt to the world. Looking at him with a distraught, burning look, the penguin asked sharply that Zik knew who he was. His voice, sounding sullen and screaming alarmingly, sounded like a rapt of reason from Zika, who for his own joy did not inform whom he was on the right. "I am the king of heaven," proudly and with inconspicuous chanting, having washed the penguin, raising my head high, the sky propping up my majesty. After such an unknown knowledge there was shock, his eyes opened wide, and his words got stuck in his throat. Zik began to laugh loudly, and the penguin was confident that his wondrous appearance impressed him with its greatness. However, he respected the super copper, like the penguin, like the king of the heavens, ungraspably Krokov before him. Once the penguin effectively became the king of heaven, Zik grinned, hoping to return to the next for help. "I want to rise high into the heavens if you help me. Everything will definitely work out in me," Zik said with enthusiasm. Penguin, proudly raising his head, placing his head, as soon as he could bow down at his feet, looked at his profanity. However, such intelligence did not suit Zeke at all. He scowled and hit the penguin on the head with his fist. After that, having lifted him on their shoulders, the stench of resentment resulted in a difficult trip of prices, a series of screams and unknown benefits. "Where are we going?" the penguin chuckled, looking at Zeke with obvious shock. With a wide laugh at his appearance, Zeke joyfully announced that their path leads straight to the very top, to the edge of the cliff. After this, pointing to the great mountain that towered in front of them, even the stars themselves could rise to the skies. El Penguin looked like he was completely uninterested in this prospect. If Zeke can't kill anyone at once, he'll have to wait another whole river, otherwise this time he'll be out of trouble. Already, from behind the stench, they sensed a booming cry, which had wandered through the entire forest, screaming awe in the wind. Turning back, Zeke fell into a stupor, and a hostile and fearful essence appeared before him. This majestic being opened its mouth wide and began to roar loudly, creating powerful sounds that shook the wind. I was wary, aware that anxiety was bubbling in the middle of this, but I was unaware that at that very moment a monster had appeared. After this, he turned to the penguin with cries for help, and those who wish him to share their strength, if only he could help him get away from this, which was very important for one. El Penguin could not use his power on the hungry little boat, telling him to share it with him. At that hour the monster began to approach, its majestic paws thumping dully on the ground, and its gaze straightened straight at them. The monster with all its strength attacked them with its majestic paws, rising up and sawing the ground. Zeke will continue to wash the ice, having just brushed his shoulders, waking up to the ruinous blow of his paw, which has passed very close, depriving himself of the wind and the moon of insecurity. He immediately noticed the brightness in the sky as the speedboat was approaching them, illuminating everything around them. As the light approached, it became clear that there was not just a dagger, but a faceless number of bright Dormouse swords that were flying from the sky, like so many forests of the wind. Dormouse swords rushed out of the sky, silent flaming arrows, and began to attack the monster, hitting him with blow after blow. A skin blow piercing the skin of the flesh, a smoldering sensation rises up and roars in burning pain. The monster fell to the ground with a thunderous sound, vibrating with a soar and a crash, and behind it appeared a familiar silhouette, which seemed to have emerged from the dark itself, ready for new trials. "Fried?" Having asked Zeke about the excitement, his voice was slightly tremulous, not believing his powerful eyes. Frid was no less healthy, his eyes were wide open, he looked at Zika, and he was caught in the act, silently rejoicing. However, when he recovered, Frid could not grasp the broad joy, but a warm chuckle appeared in his face. "I am such a radium for you," Frid said. His voice expressed wide emotions and happiness. After his glance at the penguin, which he stood in command of Zeke, Frid could not suppress a chuckle, lest Zeke find himself aware of his companion. "You died?" began to say Zeke, your voice sounding a little unsinging. Alfred already knew in advance what he wanted to ask about, because the look of the Spivrozmovnik was a reminder of that very same ask, which had already appeared in his thoughts more than once. Even as I already said, don't let anyone in on this, after flushing the wine. And he's not excluded, having become part of the absolute team. In order to evoke the memory of his ancestors, he is obliged to follow them. This was his lot, and there was nothing wrong with it, and Zeke's gaze at this moment was fixed on Frida, but he could not find out the truth in this situation. Chicher, Chiborg, having washed the penguin, killing yourself with respect. When the stench turned to the penguin, it was already holding a barbecue in a small place, even wondering why it would be better to go hungry. You're right, don't stream laughter having washed Fried. Frid continued to laugh, even respecting his companion Zeke with extreme wisdom, whose behavior was now so unmoved and untransferable that it was impossible not to laugh. Like a silhouette suddenly approaching them, Zeke and Frid interrupted their discussions, looking at each other warily. This is the phoenix, who appeared in rapture, beating the penguin from his legs. Having gotten angry, the penguin tries to get to his feet, with an angry look, wondering who he is. Pitiful bird, you are probably ruining us, less than shameful for the fact that you belong to the same race, the phoenix said thoughtfully. After that he sat on Frid's shoulder, and that one, overwhelmed, having started to cook him, naked, that's such a cause of hostility and unsafe for those who are absent. Zik was happy for 3 years after this, but not streaming with bitterness, chuckled, although he really couldn't understand how such a great thing could actually be Frid's ally. Frid nodded, confirming that Phoenix was effective and married for him, explaining that Phoenix had a little trouble with him, but was really a good guy. Phoenix, having noticed that Zik was hopelessly amazed at the new one, began to feel tired, laughing at his bewildered look and the ongoing situations, which only added to the ruin. Zik began to get angry, even without understanding why Phoenix is so boastful, but Phoenix himself, noticing his reaction, having warned that he should not allow the boy to marvel at his new voice. Even in my opinion, and also in the penguin's thought, the birds were much larger than people, smelling of freedom, flow, incredible lightness and grace, which most people could not achieve. Zik didn't understand why Phoenix was flying so high, and his dissatisfaction was only expressed, and Fried laughed in no way. Phoenix respected them as hopeless creatures who without his help would not have been able to ascend to the heavens, and he did not feel the need to sing of his indispensability and the power that could solve any problem. After that, Phoenix noted the reaction of the penguin and the mines, so that he forgot about his life and began to pour out his needs, although before the penguin would sing and be independent. Since time immemorial, Stench has been an emanation with special powers, exerting incredible power and ruling the sky, not succumbing to every circumstance, and even its power is boundless and eternal. Therefore, following their instincts, they will always run up the hill to the skies and feel their force and place, never to be lost on earth, because their nature demands eternal flight and the achievement of new ones. Height. And now the heavens are divided into 9 regions, and although the stench can rise higher, they do not cope with people. However, the stench itself can give them wings and help them ascend to heaven, the birds of the soul of this world. That Phoenix was in shock because the penguin could forget about it, and even for a new trip to the sky was an unknown part of the life, and he could not understand how such an important part could be wasted of its nature. And the penguin was clearly already at the point that Phoenix had begun to rage, even if he didn't understand why it was so important for someone else, and why he should follow these high honors if his powerful way to be completely different. The phoenix, not having lost sight of it, began to run after the penguin and beat it with its paws. Its wrath flared up, and it became clear that only one could stir up the penguin to understand the importance of the root of the sky and updating your fitness. After this, Zeke and Frid quickly disappeared into Phoenix, trying to calm him down. But in this muttering stench, they sensed the sharp sounds that were coming from the top of the mountain. Everything was awakening, and this prompted them to wake up, having become wary and forgetting about all their welding. At this moment, Mitevo turned her respect, and smiles appeared on her face, and they realized that they needed to boil. When the final heavenly ceremony is approaching, the one who rises to the next step begins a new stage of the birth, which is significant for everyone who is afraid of greater rivalries and boundless height. The stench began to rise to the top at once. The skin brought them closer to the ceremony, and a thrill of tension was felt in the air. Frid, having spit on Zika, could no longer collapse. Even realizing that it was important for him, his body was tired, and his thoughts were wandering. Otherwise, an important shadow hung over him, making his skin difficult. And then they arrived at the place, where all the contestants who were able to catch the bird were gathered. The atmosphere was full of cheers and cheers. The presenter, having risen to a small height, washed, so that the stinks of everyone had already begun to smell, and his voice sounded with great clarity, even at the moment of setting the order, and everyone's eyes were straight on them, ready for the important test. As soon as the final heavenly ceremony began, all the participants began to hush up, and one could feel the tension and calm in the air. For now, the stink stopped at the edge of the mountain, which made their ears quiver, and even though they didn't realize how they stopped in such a place, it seemed that the earth and the sky were melting into one boundless abyss. Zeke's heart began to beat faster, marveling at Fried. In his gaze there was a hint of praise, and a slight hint of anxiety appeared on his face. This was important for both of them, and they realized that regardless of all the difficulties, the stench would come out at once, no matter how loud they were. And the axis will be found, the heavenly gates will open, vibrating with bright blue colors and releasing light. And there, on the edge of the mountain, the stench stank of that very portal, which leads across the 9 rhubarbs up the mountain, in the heart of heaven, where the skin rhubarb receives its testing, and the secret places that change the share of the skin, who is tempted to gild yoga. That's right. This heavenly gate, which opens only once on the river, having washed the leading one, the hour itself has calmed down, and every word has little special feeling at this moment, if everything lay in the way of the one who dares to go through this gate. They no longer lost an hour, even a passage of creations with an atmospheric pressure. maybe even a shock. Rise into the skies with your bird soul. All your dreams and hopes are right above you, the presenter continues to say motivatingly. In order to ascend to heaven, there was only one little one. The stench can rise only in such a fit if the smiliness of bending over the edge is extracted from them. After these words, when the stench was astonished down to the bottom, the contestants felt blood in their veins. They knew that this was their chance, this was their moment, and even though it was unimportant, a short time ago would be impossible. If this tells you, then you will definitely lose, having thoroughly promoted one of the contestants. After whose life, having cut high above the ground and rushing straight into the abyss, whose body swayed in the wind, there is a silent and powerful essence that is not afraid of what is on the mountain and has felt how it pulses energy. Then the wings opened up and rose into the sky, leaving behind them a trace of light, mutely popping up anew, ready for a new stage, where they can look for unknown horizons and great possibilities. Once upon a time, a great flow of wind began to blow, which abruptly changed direction, and felt how its wings were shaking, and the expanse of heaven became unsafe and inaccessible, frantically fighting for every centimeter of height. He doesn't understand what the wind is and what happens, trying to run into the onslaught of the flow, but everything was smooth. But he could not run into the flow of wind, and began to fall down into the cliff. His wing was not overcome by the pressure of the elements, and everything that he could earn, he tried to save the wind, like the earth great wind is approaching. With the loud cry of that one flying down, whose voice mooned in the wind, mixing with the wind, creating a terrible symphony that lulled in the vastness until it flew away. Everyone was happy when they started, but they didn't get up and fell to the bottom. They sank, their hearts froze in agony. The Stinks had already begun to doubt that they could rise to the skies, and even important testing and untested conditions made it possible for them to overcome all the difficulties and achievements that the Stinks had jumped to for so long. "Fried?" Zik called out to him and started getting ready to cut his hair down. Frid ordered the ruins to prepare the krill until it burned, but in the end, the heat was lost, and they needed to work quickly. For example, Frid's wings appeared from behind in a golden color, which vibrated in the sun, depicting his inner strength and determination. The smells were majestic and powerful, not including all of his fire. Readiness to rise to heaven. And in just one fraction of a second, I was already on my way to the heavens. My wings were flying in the wind, and I was breaking through the flow of the wind without any effort. Otherwise, everything that had been lost behind became no longer a mystery, and in front was no longer boundless. Height. "Zeke, I'll go first." Having said to Frid, his voice sounded sharp and calm, otherwise he'll be ready to watch everything that's waiting beyond the threshold, and not being afraid of what he might find in the skies. Surprisingly, Zeke had mixed emotions, feeling fear, anxiety, delay, and at the same time, hope for the present world. After Frid was able to ascend to heaven, everyone began to get motivated and try to take off. They knew that the cloud was soon lost, and the gates would soon close. I knew that I couldn't keep my distance, and despite my fear, I mustered all my courage to try to fly together with them. After that, he turned to Grumpy, only realizing that he had gone somewhere, and suddenly there was silence, which further strengthened the feeling of anxiety. "Where did this penguin go?" Zik started shouting angrily. The first thoughts that popped into his head were about those that Grumpy had come in without even noticing, and he was in new doubt about the death of his old companion, and even such a thing looked suspicious. But the penguin's help was needed, because without Zik we would not be able to ascend to heaven. Therefore, he quickly turned his attention to his searches, diligently looking around the bushes and the expanses between the trees. That Zik knew the barbecue, where, and having finished, the penguin was sitting at that hour concentrating on the leftover hedgehogs. Having started to cook on the new one, the stink of the penguin becomes late, and then you want to have a snack. After that, the penguin decided to take everything with him and leave it all for later, because he realized that the important ones had to wait, and he couldn't allow himself to get tired. That Zik began to get even angrier, having scooped up the embarrassed and hungry penguin, throwing the hedgehog into the bushes. Rumbling from the bushes where Zik had thrown the urchin, they smelled a wondrous sound, similar to rustling and quiet rustling, which quickly changed to a dull gurkit, and this made them wary, even though it seemed that something was going on. "I want to get out of the shadows now." Zik chuckled, and the penguin also felt the same way, but he believed that he didn't feel anything if he was angry with him. From the bushes of the fort, the Veletensky disenchanted monster with a large cone on its head, whose eyes were burning with anger, and its majestic paws tore up the earth with a gurkot, silently ready to conquer everything in its path. Once he was in shock, his thoughts were wandering, and fear overwhelmed him if the monster continued to approach. After which the monster opened its great pasture and began to roar loudly. The sounds of its roar spread throughout the outskirts, and then the grim. Zik felt how, at the sound of these sounds, the earth began to tremble under him, and fear permeated his entire being. Not thinking long enough, they began to run forward together with the penguin, hoping to avoid being followed by the monster. The Stinks, stirring up panic with loud screams, rushed relentlessly forward, but behind them one could already sense the hot, motor-like breathing of a monster, which had suddenly sensed the rise between them. After they reached the point of collapse and panic set in, the abyss opened up before them, and there was no way back. But they couldn't allow themselves to hesitate, and not bothering to stop, they made a quick dash forward, cutting right into the dark, unknown abyss, hoping to find out the order there. The snake and the penguin embraced each other passionately, and violatingly began to fall rapidly downwards, as panic set in before their imminent fall from the ground. Having begun the blessings of the Grumpy, he opened his wings, but that hope had not been sufficiently strengthened. Zik and the penguin raptly noted that behind them the wind was rapidly growing, having cut off a monster, aka a hut, who was not going to let go of his treasure. And at the same time there were two options. Either they would be eaten by a monster, or they would be broken, and in these two options they would all die. Flying to the bottom, Zik could not come to terms with the fact that his life was coming to an end, and he was powerless to change. Who said that I'm just giving up? Zik, gritting his teeth, thought to himself, sensing how someone grows the resolve to fight until the end. There was no doubt about the decision at any price to reach heaven, and so the thought of giving up was unacceptable for him. Feeling his decisive words, Grumpy chuckled gloomily and began to release into himself a cloud of dark, ominous energy, which seemed to be alive and ready before the attack. After this insult, they fell to the ground with a great thud, the blow being so hard that the earth shook. But now, with a sharp flight of anger, leaving a trail of energy behind them, erupting through the monster, having given a beggarly blow, breaking through into a new great hole. After that, they don't hesitate to move, rushing forward straight to the heavenly gates. At that hour, from heaven's gates, a handful of other competitors gathered, who desperately wanted to break through. All their husillas were marred because the gates were already gradually closing. They lost a little for an hour, and their skin wash removed them from the dead world. The contestants had already begun to lose hope, completely giving up. They had already resigned themselves to the thought that they would not be able to break through the heavenly gates in anyone's life. Already, the stench of stench indicated that something was approaching the heavenly gates, emanations of dark energy that would flow from it. Otherwise, the shadow would be impenetrable. The black energy began to fly swiftly straight to the gate, and an invisible storm swept everything away. No one could escape the fact that she herself was able to develop such an incredible, perhaps inhuman fluidity that seemed almost supernatural. They immediately recognized Zik with a loud stench, and they were even more impressed by those who rushed to the gate, which had already closed. No one believed that they could break through and respected that their actions could no longer sign the death warrant. But not caring about all the advances and fears, Zik continued to fly forward. Having started to scream loudly, Zik with all his strength tried to break through the closed gate. Zik effortlessly tried to break through, concentrating all his energy on this single effort, and the dark energy that had emanated from him burned all over, under the skin of his ruin. "Look out!" she chanted Zik loudly. The Grumpy, having started to pronunciate "stop and simply give up, and you can even try it in the coming year." That Zik, reaffirming the importance, rinsed it sharply, so that you don't mix it up, and there won't be any oncoming fate. Even if the stench cannot pass this stage at once, then the entire passage until this stage is silent. All the contestants who were watching over this species respected him with divine respect. Their looks were filled with wonder and fear, and even no one could understand why Zik was so determined to go to the Rizik. At that hour, Fried was on the other side, checking, and starting to panic when she realized that the gates began to close. The gates became smaller and smaller, and Fried's anxiety grew, marveling at them, and realizing that the stink would appear, but Zik was still not there. Regardless of how unimportant he is, Fried still firmly believes in someone else, believing in those who won't just give up and will definitely get into trouble. At that very moment, Zik, clenching his teeth under the strain, not taking his attempts to break through the massive gate, putting all his strength and determination into it. Having gathered all their strength and screamed with all their remaining strength, they will still decide to break through. Having received Zik's help, Fried could not contain his joy, even though his heart was filled with hope that Zik would be able to accomplish his plans, regardless of all the difficulties. "What did you catch? Let's fly," having chuckled at the interview, having washed Zik. At once, with incredible energy and indefatigable determination, the Stinks flew into the wind, rushing to the mountain, dumb alone, ready to hem all the webs on their road. The tables were collapsing like crazy, so everyone was amazed and couldn't figure out what they were getting into. "I'll find you here," Zik thought in thought. When the Stinks had already flown up to the oncoming storm, a strong wind began to blow. The wind became tense, and Zik and Freedom noticed how the elements were trying to push them back. Despite the stormy, naughty wind, which smelled of their winds, the Stinks were still able to break through, instantly approaching their mark. In front of them is a wrapped open, spluttering view of a beautiful place, as if the city of the fallen Ikari stood on the first plane of heaven, where ruins and man-made miracles intertwined with the foggy light, creating an atmosphere of mysterious grandeur. "We're on our way," Zik hummed with joy in his voice, sensing how his heart would be filled with buryings from the fact that the stench had reached the first snowstorm. There they were already checked by the chief of staff, named Meilin, who ordered them to go down to the bottom. The contestants of the meeting obeyed her order, even though no one was afraid to break the law, knowing that their inheritance could be untransferable and extremely vicious. After which they arrived at the first-level security office. The guards respectfully guarded their skin, ready for any unforeseen situation. In this office, Zik immediately contacted Grumpy, and Zik, concentrating, began to talk, hoping that he could smell him. Vin tried to explain that it was not Vin, but the penguin who broke the law, who, in his opinion, having become the guilty party of all the misunderstandings, lulled less and less about his word. "Ozvono yak? Sign it please this time," having died and not believing it, Malin said. "The fragments of it were worse than destruction, and I will have to pay a fine, having found out about it, but I will definitely breathe a sigh of relief, but I won't end up worse." In local penny currency, Zik had to pay 500 nasins in order to get food and go further, and even so, there was one form of disarray in this world. Feeling about such a significant amount, Zik began to express blessings about forgiveness, trying to reconcile the guards, so that he is ready to correct his pardon and vows not to break the rules again. "I need to get up even more quickly," Zik thought to himself. At this moment, another contestant turned up to Zik, who was also arrested, and pleased him to simply give up, saying at the very least, a decision, even though the struggle was already hopeless and only aggravated the situation. These words incredibly angered Zika Vin, who turned sharply until the contestant's eyes lit up with fire and appeared in his face with the determination of anyone ready to ensure that he did not hesitate in the face of the greatest difficulties. "They won't even think of listening to your lighthouse, having died, having washed the contestant," looking at Zik with an expression of skepticism at the appearance. After these words, the contestant began to be threatened with destruction, and the atmosphere immediately became tense, and everyone realized that any careless move could lead to serious consequences. "Isn't he also a contestant?" Zik thought to himself. His owners and friends looked extremely stern, and it was clear that he was clearly not an ordinary lad, but at the same time it was impossible to say that his manner of behavior here for a long time showed a deep lack of understanding in the minds of the magistrates. But Zik could not think it all over before he began to press Malin again so that he could simply sign as if he wanted to leave the office. You realize that in such a situation there is nothing to gain, and it seems you will again have to rob someone in order to get out of this herd and find a way out of difficulties. And immediately this contestant jumped up from his place, which greatly shocked Zika, but he clearly did not perceive such a reaction and could not understand what he himself wanted to achieve at this moment. "I can't take it anymore, and I won't endure it," she screamed loudly and slammed the table, saying "Vine." The police officers began to rush to the office, aka the contestant, without even smelling them, and returned to Meilin with groans to close up. After which, with great fury, he hit one of the spies on the head with his fist. The blow was violent and strong, and instantly caused chaos in the room. The sportsmen, the sleepers, began to react, trying to get out of the situation, but nothing came of it, and even the contestant intended to kill the entire office. In response to another heavy blow, Zik fell out of his chair, holding the pen in his hands, and suddenly hitting it directly on the nose of one of the doctors. Vin began to scream loudly in pain, and Zik shook his head and asked not to look at anyone. Otherwise, they didn't hear that Zik, the spy verbitnik, started screaming that they stink of offensive evildoers and they need to be terminally arrested. And after they were left behind, there were no guards with protection, ready to be arrested. Their looks were so decisive that it became obvious that it would be impossible to get in. The contestant laughed and asked Zik to cover him from behind, but Zik himself could not understand how it had come to this. Without realizing anything, one of the spies was already approaching Zika, ready to attack. He was unable to react in any way as the virus attacked and injured him. Having started to get angry, his emotions grew, and at that moment the black energy of a penguin appeared on his right hand. "What is going on here?" Zik shouted loudly. Like a raptum, a black glove appeared on his hand. Made of energy, it wrapped around his hand, and at that moment Zik was still wondering where the grumpy had gone. But there was no time to think about it, and even the spy Robitnik began to attack him again. And now my Churga, having pressed the armor of the Spivotnik and getting ready to the blow, washed Zik. You hit it with all the force, and the blow of the table is tight, so that the sponger immediately loses its strength. The contestant and Zik continued to struggle. Emotions were running high. The stench of resentment was becoming more intense. The skin was trying to gain advantage from this baked essence. They began to attack Zik in twos at a time, and the situation became even more critical since his hands were under control, and the chances of escaping became less and less. Alvin, concentrating on his new strength, wears a black glove to repel blows and resist the competitor's attacks. Having quickly assessed the situation, he drew on the energy of the black glove to concentrate and advance his reaction. Having become more frail, the skin of one's own hands learns to avoid blows and keep pace with one another in order to create for oneself whatever room for maneuver one wants. As the new soldiers came and went, it seemed that there was no end to them, and their numbers began to swell as if there was no way out, and Zik felt more and more emaciated. The stench drained away from him, trying to attack from his sides so that there was no chance of escaping. So as the stinks began to attack him, the stinks hit his mittens, and it knocked out all the spies on different sides. "I'm glad I'm happy," raising your hand to the mountain, washing Zik with a new resolve. After which Zik struck with force with his hand in the frame, breaking it and creating a small earthquake. The earth began to shake, and a surge of energy passed throughout the room, throwing out opponents. With loud screams and intense energy, the guards flew to different sides, losing control over the situation, and having already prepared themselves for the meeting, they realized that the situation had gone out of control. Under control. Those who rose up learned with wonder that Zik was a very strong opponent, and the smell of battles could not help but attribute his strength and vigor to him. "What are you greeted? What else do you want to get rid of?" With pride and a laugh at the accusation, having washed the wine. As if with a loud voice, the earth began to tremble, and a green light appeared in the sky, illuminating everything, even as the heavens themselves were preparing for something grandiose and irrevocable. The green light began to fill the entire sky, expanding and creating a magical atmosphere. Didko just not at once, having washed the contestant out of anxiety. Zik could not comprehend what was happening, and without losing his joy, he tisked at the contestant, who herself evoked such a wondrous and terrible atmosphere. We angered the judge. Everyone started shouting, sensing that the situation was getting worse, and the green energy continued to spread across the sky. Everyone began to scream loudly. Panic gripped people, and they quickly fled to the shelter, trying to cope with the unknown danger that was approaching with the storm. A majestic hand began to descend from the sky, cleave from the Velethan vines, which had flared up in a terrible intensity, ready to consume everything on their way. This hand grabbed the contestant, and not caring about his struggle, hit with force on the underside, creating a strong vibration, as if everything shook, and then filled with a roar and a soar. At this point, Zik was thrown to the side a couple of meters, and a cloud of smoke appeared. When Dima's veil lifted, Zik shook the Valetnian batter on the ground with his hand, and in the middle lay the tireless contestant. The soldiers began to point at Zika with their fingers, calling to the great hand to get away from him, their voices filled with panic and impatience, even as they realized that their chances of being able to survive lay under this pushing force. At that hour, Friedishoff walked along the streets of the place of the first level of heaven. "Where has Zik gone again?" jokingly, having watched Frid feeling restless. As if Fried had realized that he had gathered together, discussing obvious concerns, people whispered one after another, indicating on the floor that they were meeting nearby. Coming closer, Fried, softly seeming, shocked, and even those who had grown, overturned all his awareness, a majestic hand that descended from the sky, and the panic that engulfed the place. In the kaidans with the gods of Oz, Zeke, who had one misunderstanding in his eyes, could not understand how he came to such a situation, and why everything changed so quickly. Unless, of course, before the court's ruling, the state is criminally punished, Zik was expected to be punished, and even in this case, the stability and security of the world was threatened. Lie, with tears in my eyes having washed Zik. After an hour, the stench arrived in the dark oven, crushed by vines, where the wind was damp and cold, and light ice made its way through the thick foliage, creating a mysterious atmosphere. The stench reached the end of the oven and began to sound sharply. "Check, please," Malin said. She was obliged to immediately contact the judge, who reached the wall with vines that stood in front of them. "I detain the evildoers," Malin said with a sly laugh, after which the doors opened in front of them, from which the bright light began to shine. The mute stench was lost into another world, where everything was unknown and mysterious. Light flooded the space, casting long shadows on the walls' ovens. Let's brighten the table so that Zik must flatten his eyes so as not to go blind, perceiving how his eyes are trying to adapt to the unexpected brightness that has penetrated through the storm Yogo Poviki. Having opened his eyes, he saw the original green clearing in front of him and the bright light that flooded everything. There was a sofa standing in the middle of this clearing, where everyone had slept, and it looked absolutely unrestrained. Zeke chuckled. "What kind of place is this?" To which Malin proudly confirmed that this is the garden of the judge himself, the place where he should spend an hour, strengthened in the face of this world, in a quieter and secrecy. Coming closer, the stinks stained the red sofa, and on the new man slept, his calm sleep looked in contrast to the intense atmosphere of tension, otherwise in the hour, and the turbos of this world. Zik showed respect, and said about those who couldn't sleep there, and those words angered Malin. "Yak rude. You can't really recognize who is in front of you," Malin stated confidently. "The people themselves are the first rank and place of Icarus, and at the same time, looking like a turbo-free world in their sleep, it will infuse everything with an almost invisible part of the stability of this world." The gardener of Junius, the great judge of the first rank, in the name of Thesis, was one of the most prominent figures in this world, whose role was in the third order and in the present justice, not locked. "Contestants, you who were lucky enough to ascend to heaven," said Malin. "That's why he was buried, because before him stood such a great person, like Thesis at the same time another contestant, who stood as a guard, respecting the whole funny, whose face showed dissatisfaction." "Those who were lucky enough to ascend to heaven? And what about that lad's rack?" the contestant said, pointing his finger at the judge. Those guards immediately reacted to his words. They pressed him with an armor to his neck, so that such words respect the will of the great judge. The judge spoke raptly, his face wrinkled with irritation, and he began to become overwhelmed, having just fallen asleep, and he was uncontrollably awakened. His voice was low and completely dissatisfied, otherwise there would have been a moment of calm for him. "We are extremely important." "I bring my vibration, Mr. Judge," Malin said, standing on one knee. After that, judging, slightly raising their eyebrows, chuckling, what kind of guys are in charge of her, looking at Zik with sarcasm, and also with a noticeable wariness, neither assessing what they themselves want to see no-go. "What's the problem in my heavenly garden?" Pozhvuvsh is drinking wine. Malin confirmed the judge's guesses by taking Zik by the handcuffs. Vaughn added that the big guy is a villain who constantly creates problems, and the little guy is a devilish contestant who just arrived from the lower lands. It's a really rotten man who hasn't yet crippled all of his people, and it's a shame to come under the 4th paragraph of the article about the evil of the beating of Icarus. In Malin's opinion, they deserve punishment, but the judge was very pleased with this. If he was too lazy, he tried to turn around himself, which made Malin angry, even if he did it so quickly and it was too much. Is this one really careless in his own mind? Zik thought to himself. Having taken and thrown everything onto the girl, shifting all the responsibility onto her, at that hour like Zik, they are keeping an eye on the situation, thinking that he is the local king of this place, and that his power and inflow are looming, make him infallible at these walls. And it was similar to those that the technique of hand with vines is not so common anymore, although Zik really was evil beyond its dimensions. You guys are already busy, let's just leave, and I also have a lot of things to do, Zik said, making Malin angry. At that hour, the other contestant, gritting his teeth in irritation, cackled, and Thesis is still going to behave like a complete idiot, not streamlining his aggression, and even though he can no longer tolerate such a disrespectful pose, until all of them. I will tear you into pieces, having ripped apart the kaidan, the deepest fierceness, having washed the wine. After that, he quickly ran up to the court, his eyes burning with anger and screaming loudly, getting ready for an attack, chanting that the moment had come for the end of all food once and again. Everyone was shocked by this unexpected turn of events, even though no one realized that one of the participants would risk breaking the rules so abruptly and attacking the judge himself. Why don't you stand up to me, having passed out after washing the physis? After the spiky bush began to climb into his finger, its prickly frond began to twirl forward at will. The rapt came out of the table, which became incredibly long our list, and forcefully pierced the contestant. After this, from the silent sky, vines began to rise, quickly descending and flowing through the body of the contestant. Then the contestant fell to the ground without a trace, his body was filled with pain, and his blood began to flow quickly along the ground, leaving a red trace. The silence burned everyone. When Zik looked at this greedy picture, he took in the words, and he was caught in the heat, not believing his eyes. His body became important, and his heart was beating with crazy speed, as it seemed that everything was the same. Maybe with my share of power. Malin, you were completely right. This man was indeed a villain, having passed the court. Having pointed to Zeke, having apparently washed his vote, having said that he may spend 10 years working in his place, without the possibility of depriving him in order to calm down his affairs and rectify the situation, as Vinikla via Yogo D. That Zik simply could not believe his ears and even seemed absolutely not invested in his statement about how everything was not enough. His head had long ago seen completely different plans, and now everything has gone to pieces. Your punishment has been voiced, please follow me. I was furious with Zika, Malin. However, he categorically did not accept such punishments. Zik could not recover, since everything had gone so far, and the thought of being lost there was absolutely unbearable for him. Malin was extremely annoyed by Zik's behavior, and even respected her as absolutely unpleasant and inappropriate. After this, without any emotion, she struck him hard in the face, hoping to bring him to calm down. Did you want to live any more? Rosa Rosanna asked Vaughn. Al-Zik is ready to die, because on his thought it would be better, at least 10 years of rotting in this place, every day he would be deprived, and every day he would be mindless and without prospects. Merlin was shocked after such words. Gritting her teeth, she stood and marveled at him, not believing that Zik was ready for such. Her eyes were filled with anger and fury, and she could not understand why you have to decide to live your life so ruthlessly. But you don't know anything, Zik said loudly. Zika said that no one understands, and people are constantly trying to make his plan work and put chains in the wheels that respect his development. And you will simply collapse to one single world and reach paradise, depriving everyone of the surrounding world later. After these words, the judge's expression sharply changed, his eyebrows furrowed, and his eyes lit up with storminess. What do you allow yourself to do? Malin screamed angrily, her eyes flashed with anger, and her voice filled with anger and storminess. After this, she sharply screamed at one of the guards, and directly facing Zik, began to loudly quote the statute of the law which she had thoroughly destroyed. Tsebula statya persha, the first point of the image of the great judgment, according to this law. For such offences more than one world of death punishment was given. Remember that Malin already wanted to inflict punishment, apparently reluctantly raising her hand and clenching it before striking. And now, having begun to obey me, he has swindled the judge with a sly smile. After which, Zik began to be taken out of the funeral checkpoint, where Fried had already checked. Zik! Fred shouted loudly, after which he began to run to the next one. He was very worried about him. His voice trembling with anxiety, and fear for his friend appeared in his eyes, even thinking that this time he would definitely die. Malin said that he was simply spared, and by the grace of the court, his punishment was exchanged for probation. After hearing these words, Zik was surprised, even though he had no idea how the experiment had happened. Malin explained that they would not be able to go up to the next stage and undergo the rigorous testing without the permission of the judge. The more you want to rise, the more energy you need. Those who are able to undergo testing go to the advancing ball of the earth, having taken the mark. And having just arrived at the first meeting, and having already received him, Malin asked if she would like a little money for such generosity. After which Malin gave Zeke a handful of papyrus. Her look was important and completely hidden. After saying goodbye briefly, she quickly looked around and went to leave, depriving him of his food. Fred admitted that all the information about the testing was in his pocket. The smells began to swallow this throat at once, and read what was written in it, respectfully hearing out loud the word on their skin that could lead the key to their distant path. Never mind those same tests, amazingly washed away the stench with one voice. After which the stench immediately headed to the gathering place of Ikaru, the plains of Unius. If you believe what is written there, then those who need to be here are guilty of washing fried. At that hour, Zik could not believe that the test was so easy, even if they just needed to bring 2 apples. Having started to get angry, he couldn't comprehend that he had come up with this idea, and Fred realized that it didn't look like something he had tried out, but rather like something he had learned. Raptum instructed them to speak to Grumpy, who seemed to be the spy who showed up, and asked them to know the same hedgehog that Zika barked at. After that, Zik started to cook it, for those who came in at the most needed moment, and now turned only for the sake of the hedgehog. You are a vociferous person. You can immediately see the stars of your birth, snatching Grumpy, having washed away the phoenix. Then Zik hurried both of them out of business, shouting at them that they smelled the stink too much. And while Zik was threatening and shouting at them, Fred knew the very fruit tree they needed. After which Fred told Zeke to call it a day and go to the end of testing, even if the hour didn't wait, and the skin quill could become extreme. "What's there?" I asked Fred about this. When they got closer, the stench began to smell like the white rabbits. To Fred they seemed very strange and unreasonable, just like Zeke, without hesitation, without learning from them anything either marvelous or special, accepting everything as carefully as possible. After this, with a hint of serenity and decisiveness, Zik raised his head, straightened his back, and bravely walked forward, alert to the rabbits, ready to overcome all difficulties. Coming closer, the stinks showed up with an unexpected surprise, which shocked them and sent them into shock. These were not ordinary little rabbits, but majestic rabbits, especially those who were inspired by military mysteries. The stinks appeared like velvet, with great postures and terrible teeth, majestic red eyes, like scorching and roaring loudly. But the boys didn't cry at all, however. The stinks were respected, and with a miraculous drive they rose. With laughs on the faces of the stinks they began to prepare for an attack. Having asked Grumpy for it, he was ready to fight, and at that moment Grumpy was incredibly excited, even impatiently checking the ability to eat delicious rabbit meat. Fred, without getting up either, grabbed his sword and rushed to Phoenix, asking him to marry them sooner so as not to ruin his honor. After this, they acted in a powerful and beneficial way, combining their forces into one force, and with great determination they began to attack the rabbits, without depriving them of any chance of escape. The stinks of the river without a carriage rushed to the vicinity of the rabbits, ready for battle, with the same energy and concentration on their mark. Their skin was of the same quality, and even they knew that victory was closer, no matter what. Before the blow of the disconnected rabbit, Zik jabbed raptically, militarily moving to the side in order to dodge the attack. After this, Zik turned around and gave a forceful blow to the rabbit's head. The blow was so strong that the wing fell to the ground, and blood began to flow from his mouth. Other rabbits began to attack Zik, who were eager for new, fierce, and aggressive attacks, and actively defending themselves from blows, quickly dodging and parrying attacks. After this, the signs of decisiveness independently proceeded to the attack, launching heavy attacks on the rabbits with the help of the dark energy of the penguin, permeating everything. However, Fred did not get up from him. 3 rabbits rushed at him, trying to fight, and just in time to prepare for defense. Gritting his teeth, with all his might he unleashed an attack on them with his sword, putting all his strength into the leather strike. His powerful blow struck so hard that he killed 3 rabbits in one fell swoop. Turning to Zack, he shouted loudly, being careful ahead of him, because behind him one of the rabbits had already rushed to attack. Mitevo turned around and swung, so that the wing was already on the verge of attack, ready to pounce on the new one with incredible fluidity. His instincts triggered Mitevo, and he was preparing to attack with unsafe. However, Zack quickly reacted and continued to fight, showing incredible intimacy, blocking the crawl kick, repelling the attack, and not giving the enemy any chance. "Tikai Zvitsi!" Zack yelped, hitting the rabbit with all his might. After which Zack accused Frida for those who had stolen him, saying that he was not guilty, then the rabbits would have been taken away from him a long time ago, to Frida Vidpoff, so that the stench would have been with them long ago got even. "We need to finish with them now," Fred said with a laugh. Laughingly, Zack had waited with Fred and confirming his resolve, preparing for a new attack, not giving the rabbits the best chance of recovery. After this fierce battle began, Zack and Fred, not bothering to fight, killed the rabbits one by one, each blow becoming fatal for the enemies. A dozen hours later, the stench was suffocating, standing tall, billowing in clouds of smoke, rising above the battlefield. When the fog began to develop, the stink stood with pride on the struggling rabbits, even after the testing was completed, and they felt joy at their victory, and realized that their efforts had borne fruit. About an hour later, having harvested the fruits, the stinks were already in the area, discussing the results of the recent testing. And now, it's no longer possible to bring these fruits to the gathering. They laugh joyfully, having washed Fred, realizing that success is already close to the achieved goal. Penguin began to complain that he wanted something sweet, and even though his head was already spinning, Zack, sensing his skunk, asked how to stop the stink. He should feed him. Check the fork, sharply jumping and looking forward, chanting Zack. Zack and Fred fell asleep in front of the majestic, endless black, which stretched for many meters, crumbling in front. The stench simply could not believe the powerful eyes, and they were extremely shocked and stretched so far that the end was never visible. There was a majestic crowd of contestants, turning around among some of the children with angry and gloomy faces, clearly dissatisfied with the results or the difficulties that arose during the testing period. Having worked for such a long time, the penguin realized that they were handing out catless hedgehogs, and without missing a beat, hastening ahead, carefully distributing them on their short legs. Noticing the angry accusations of the contestants, the penguin tilted his head in a sad manner and asked why he wanted something sweet. "It seems that you are here first." Having washed the man, who was drinking from the dance, he was looking at the penguin with a smile. This man asked a lot about testing, squealing, and how easy it was, to which Zeke and Finn nodded in unison, agreeing with his words. After which the man added with a grin that he had the same problem as they did. But the boys didn't quite understand what this meant, as a booming loud noise uttered behind them, which gained their respect. Turning around at the sound of a scream, the stench stank of the boy, who was ruinously running here and there, screaming, and the man, laughing cheerfully, and commenting that he had obviously just over-exaggerated. Fred and Zack could not understand why the judge had such a wonderful fetish for apples, but they little suspected that his head meta was intended to irritate them and drive them out of trouble. "I know, and it's not a mistake, so this is all I'm doing to spoil you." Having washed the man, they grinned slyly, holding the dance in their hands. But the boys couldn't believe it, and they respected that the man was just talking to a woman. And this person began to explain that Fissy was ice cold, beyond words, and that they were simply played for no reason. There was only one guilty mind, giving a pass to one person only once a month, and this ability became extremely important for those who could quickly get a chance. This novelty shocked them to the depths of their souls. They could not believe the powerful smells, and overcome with emotions, they began to rush around, discussing how they might be able to do so. "Are you happy? That's why there are a lot of contestants who by fate cannot rise higher." Having washed the head, they smile lightly. He continued to explain that moving to the next stage, even if you win the lottery, will require not less effort, but also a lot of money. At this moment, Zack began to guess about that lad from the hospital. Now the real reason for the rebellion has come to light, how the lad who ruled was the one who violated freedom and justice in the world, where all the world seemed to know in the moment. At this point, the boys realized that in such a situation they were expecting great problems, aka the transition, that the stench could not be passed through. Al finishing the dance, the man noticed with a smile that luck seems to be on his side. Even tomorrow may be their lucky day, meaning with a laugh, no singing that fate has already prepared good luck for them. However, the boys marveled at this new development, not understanding what it was that was worth respecting, and got lost in its mysterious words. They exchanged glances, trying to find some clue. The evening came, and Zack and Fred walked around the place, looking at everything in detail, enjoying the atmosphere and fascinating details. They watched over the children, who, laughing loudly, ran around the place, playing at their games and enjoying their turbo-free life. After finishing, Zack noted that upon arriving on this earth, he immediately realized that it was a completely different world. I read about this place in history books, as I knew people at home, having said Fred. In this book it was written that Icarus is a place beyond the first level where the contestants go. This is a densely populated and economically developed region, which impressed with its architecture, culture, and dynamic rhythm of life. Contestants need equipment to rise to the next level of heaven, and this is what the local residents sell. These competitors are always denied the opportunity to rise higher, or rather, they are simply given hope that they can achieve success, as the way seems to be folded and impenetrable. All the competitors with every fate are trying to show more and more passion and diligence, trying to achieve success. And through a great number of people, many of whom recognize failures among them, this place has become known as a place where people are often deprived of their lives. The people who want to rise to the sun have sunk, so this place is called Icarus, and even his bastards, like the legendary Icarus, die about the heights, but often face reality, which lets them down. After this, Zack and the Penguin began to get angry, even if they hated nerds, and they would have been better off without this information. In case of any emergency, we need to be more confident in our return, having sipped the wine with an awkward smile. After about an hour, the smells reached the gates of the first level of Whitewood, which exuded their majesty and mystery. This was a spacious maiden, where a lot of people gathered, who were actively flocking and sharing their enemies about what was happening nearby. And in the middle of the maiden stood no one else, as Judge Physis, who would open the gate and the date of passage to the coming rush of heaven. People began to shout loudly and swear, filling the maiden with energy and burying, and also hoping for good luck. That same judge, obviously, not being at the capture of this species, preserving a calm expression of denunciation, will lead to the destruction of the same species. I'll soon figure this out and go to bed again. Having a rest, having washed the judge, I guess it's important to finish this show soon. The whole area around the court was enveloped in greenery as it began to sparkle and shimmer, attracting the respect of all those present. From this light, vines began to appear, which rose completely to the sky, intertwining and creating hostile little stars around the court. In the meantime, the number of vines has doubled, creating a hostility that the stench of mutes is alive, growing and burrowing into more and more space. After this, the forest disappeared, cut up from vines which opened up completely, leading to an unknown expanse beyond the boundaries. This expanse began to fill with green light, as warmth and magic emerged, again filled with a special energy. Everyone was hostile to what they had done, their thoughts began to simmer, and only their anger bubbled up on their faces, and their mouths became closed due to shock. Incredibly, this is the truth of the gates of heaven? Zik and Fred were amazed by such a majestic and insignificant species. Their eyes could not look away, and the stench, it seems, could not believe what they were drinking in front of myself. Alazika wanted food, since it is truly the gates of heaven, the very ones that open once again on the river. Like a rapture, a familiar voice was felt, that of Malin, whose presence in the meeting angered Zika. He could not suppress his storm, and even her skin words screamed in a new storm of emotions. Vaughn could not believe that they were once again questioning the competence and ineptitude of their judge, despite all the previous evidence of his professional competence. "Do you think he is not powerful enough?" Malin said with renewed joy in her eyes, her gaze becoming firm, otherwise she was ready to block any attempt to question the power of the judge. She was sung with his power, even with the very Mother Nature god, to whom she had bowed for 500 years. The Beulah was reconstructed because of its majestic power. As the stench wafted in front of them, it was not accessible to the skin, except for those who were destined to become a part of his great plan. At that moment, everyone began to pray, hoping that once again the gates of heaven would be closed. Their eyes were focused, their hearts beat in unison, and prayers poured into the sky with the same faith and hope. Fred and Zik began to exchange chuckles, their eyes narrowed, and they could not escape from the fires. With a laugh, one of them said that no one would look at them, as they could wrap the gates themselves something else. An axis, after many ridges of tense and alarming awakening, the massive gates began to unravel, opening up paths to something mysterious and perhaps lamellar. Then, mind you, the vines that were entwining the gates began to break off, and it became so fast that the judge was unable to stream the air. These thick green tufts, which had probably so reliably wrapped themselves around the gates, began to grow weak, and one by one they broke away, disintegrating to the ground. Everything broke through a bunch of vines, leaving behind them the emptiness. The wind became thick due to the tension, and an uneasy silence prevailed in the faces of those present. Standing undisturbed, we squawked, and the little moths felt their heads, watching out for the vines to fall from the sky one by one. Everyone was stifled with congestion, and the stench was caught with their mouths open, unable to escape, which they themselves would be forced to do. Malin became nervous, her eyes darting along the tattered vines. She approached the court, and with alarm in her voice, she tisked as if she was going to get it. Look, the gates were broken. They died washed through the judges. After these words, the judge said goodbye, and without turning around walked away, and the people who were guarding his exit did not show up. They began to shout after him, calling him from those in need over them. The stench began to scream at the top of their voices, telling him that he had not finished his clothes, and insisting that he had no right to sing like that. Many people could not understand why he himself occupied this seat, and this critical statement was sealed by the judge. "How are you fighting me?" those present wondered with a frown at the judge. Judging by the evidence of internal irritation, she raised her hand up in the air and shook her hand as an endless number of thick vines began to envelop her hand. After this, he sharply hit the ground with his hand, and at the same time awakened the force that was called the angry earth, which seemed ready to sweep everything into its path. Numerous vines, our living creatures, began to rapidly emerge from the ground, targeting people who had frozen in wonder, guarding this species. The vines were falling rapidly and chaotically. The powerful rose was unusually small, forcing the crowd of everyone who was nearby, creating an atmosphere of panic and impending threat. Zik and the penguin, covered in fire, began to howl, and Fred Mitt, reacting, reached for his sword. Ruin! Having drawn his sword, Fred sat in concentration, his eyes burning with determination, and calling out to his mighty phoenix. Fred, with a swift flash, cut through the vines with his sword that were approaching him, and before the flapping of Zika and the penguin. The remaining contestants, despite all efforts, could not withstand the onslaught of the evil vines. The screams were mixed with pain when the sharp thorns of the vines dug into the skin, healing deep wounds. Standing above them, judging that it is so impossible to stop and just sing, and that you can certainly send someone to the next stage. But the problem was that the tree had reached the end of its life, and the judge was in trouble, and who knows what the competition will cost for a replacement. And if we transfer it to the coming river, then we are sure that all the stinks will irritate him again, so he came up with one idea. The whole idea was to send several contestants to the next level. This newness at that moment shocked and dismayed all those present, and there was a remarkable possibility of rising to the next level. People began to feel the need to reach another level, and there was a head turn that led them ahead and inspired them with new strength. And what fate was expected to be accepted by several people, what seemed incredibly possible, has now become a reality. Even every one of those present had a sleeping and one meta, and with this, the tree was a symbol of their hopes and fire. Even every one of those present had a sleeping and one meta, and with this, the tree was a symbol of their hopes and fire. Through the forest, among the intertwined roots of the trees, the wondrous sounds of a foolish galas mooned, similar to the noise of the croaking cries that were known in the dark. One of the contestants, all sleepy and out of breath, rushed through the forest, trying to reach some important mark. Two contestants quickly flew behind him, mocking and throwing sarcastic remarks, trying to catch him. The stinks harassed him, laughing and staring, calling him their treasure. This whole situation was extremely dangerous, but the problem lay not least in the contestants themselves. This place itself was extremely unsafe, with chimerical dangers and dangers that created constant unsafe conditions for anyone who dared to enter this territory. The contestant tensed up, feeling his heart beat faster, and not knowing what to do, out of fear, and realizing he was just running, not thinking. 3 years before this event, the contestants arrived in the very heart of Ikaru, in the forest of tree roots, a special forest for the judge. It's up to you to judge who supports this forest and gloom to serve as a support for Icarus, so that all the world's equals lie under his will. The forest possesses current technologies and methods for ensuring complete safety, transforming it on the unique nature and progress. Malin knew that there were pastes installed everywhere, and they should be careful and know the essence of the tree. This bad judge, having spent everything so that life would not be a blessing for us, Zeke thought to himself. The contestants did not take Malin's words seriously and began to gawk and boast that it was impossible to slather them with pasta. That Malin quietly, without so much as a word, pulled a small apple from her pocket and began to twirl it in her hands, otherwise trying to turn it tightly. After she showed the apple, she raptly, without missing a word, abruptly threw it back behind her back, wanting to wake up this small object. But then from the beginning, vines appeared and wrapped themselves around him, flowing into small apple slices. It impressed the contestants to the depths of their souls, and the stench, not streaming with emotions, opened their mouths in shock, not believing their powerful eyes. The penguin became embarrassed because he had lost a small piece of the apple. This really embarrassed him. He looked like that, having lost all his remaining hope for a tasty snack. Having washed it, there is still a small bag of fruit in them, but the penguin is not happy because they want a fruit pie. All participants were determined to help and were ready to deal with any obstacles or opponents that might arise in the factory. It seems that the competition is becoming even more intense, with significant nervousness from Fred. That Zik again and again declared that the Stinks can subdue all the Supernicks, even for whose sake the Stinks came here. And at that very moment the Stinks rushed forward with the laughs that shone on their faces. Thus began the struggle for survival in the midst of the wild forest, where the roots of the trees became the only support. Among the contestants, the number of victims grew rapidly, which added even more tension and a sense of insecurity. And competition suddenly grew, transforming the skin's approach to testing. The weak wasted their remaining chances, and the strong brought their advantage, fighting for their ability to live. In that hour of chaos and fierce struggle, Zeke and Fred tried to survive with great courage. The Stinks were already running towards the majestic stone that hovered behind them, and screaming loudly. Fred started shouting to Zeke so that he could move on, even if the stone had already caught up with them, and less time was lost. Zeke got angry at the penguin, and called him out for the fact that he himself was at fault, and having pushed through it, they ended up in such trouble. As the stench rushed forward, Zeke raptly expressed respect for the wondrous sounds that fell ahead of them. Marveling forward, they suddenly realized that they could simply run into the pasture. Majestic growths spread out in front of them, as if they were waiting for the moment to crush them, ready to absorb them with their straining mouths. Zik has already reached the very mouth of this greedy growth, and she has opened her majestic mouth, ready to bury him. However, he quickly reacted and squirmed, stepping aside to avoid contact with the tree. After this vine, these trees began to grab his arms and legs, trying to tighten them to his mouth, but Zik struggled mightily, trying to escape. But fortunately, she was able to emerge from the vines and escape, only escaping from their grip, turning into a deadly herd. "What the hell is with this forest?" Zik shouted loudly. After about an hour, Zik and Fred took a walk in the deep thickets, huddled among the intertwined roots of trees, trying to calm down and regain strength after the ordeal they had experienced. The Stinks were glad that they had lost their lives, but suddenly they could not wake up because of the miracle. It seemed as if the forest had come to life, starting to rustle and crumble around them like the skin of their crown. Having started to cook on the penguin, they blame him for the fact that he cannot be deprived of one for a living, and even through his skin the stench kicks into even greater trouble. Fred and Phoenix, watching over their welding, thought that there was, without a doubt, 2 pairs of boots. Just as Zik and the penguin were cooking, the Phoenix and Fred himself sensed some strange unconscious sounds. They immediately became wary, and even the sounds clearly did not mean anything good. Up there, everyone is waking up. The Phoenix has begun to scream loudly. Raising their eyes to the sky, the Stinks swayed the Velatin monsters, which descended from the trees with their gigantic paws. Phoenix, despite all the trouble, knows how funny it is, respectfully, that the Stinks have again disappeared into one of the pastures of this cunning forest. These monstrous mosquitoes began to attack them with their majestic slits, grazing the wind and quickly approaching, frighteningly reacting to them, lest they be crushed into paste. Zeke and Fred quickly assumed a fighting pose, preparing to attack. They knew that they needed to act quickly and effectively in order to be able to better deal with these majestic mosquitoes. Zik stagnated the power of the penguin in order to tear apart these great monsters, scattering them on all sides. After this Zik, they don't hesitate. They begin to quickly run on the fast track, getting ready to get to the point. After that Zik, they do not hesitate, giving her a blow with all the force, not giving her the best chance for a fight. But this blow was sent without harming her, which caused Zika to be in great distress. Fred had the same situation. He hit his sword with his sword, but the whole world did not collapse. Zik and Fred met 1-to-1, turning their backs simultaneously. They were truly strong opponents, aka Fred, respectfully keeping an eye on the situation ahead of Zeke so that she could use her strength wisely. After which Fred concentrated his energy in his hands, and a great fat ball appeared, which showed incredible tension. "What is this skill and how will you Vicarist?" having asked Zeke. After that, dozens of swords began to fly from that yellow ball, which under the control of Fred flew straight into the coma. All the swords, concentrating all their force, hit the scythe with incredible force, creating a mighty vibration. After such a blow, the Komaka became angry, and it seems she gained even more strength. She began to attack them, again opening her majestic cracks and rapidly approaching Zika and Fred. Zeke quickly turned into a penguin, asking how to control him by force. That penguin who knows nothing believes that he forgot how to use his power, which angered Zeke. At that moment, Zeke noticed how the mosquito had attacked him again, and the majestic cracks were quickly approaching. Komaka entered into Zika, and he saw how the fires of the cracks were breaking his defense, following the streaming blow. Zeke desperately tried to get up on his feet, but he could not allow himself to fall. His life and existence lay under the skin of his skin. As soon as the penguin's strength in the mittens began to grow, his body was filled with energy. This intense dark energy began to cover everything until then, filling the space around Zeke. After this, Zeke collected all the energy that he had given to his penguin and concentrated it in one forceful blow. Zeke couldn't believe what they found was activated. After that, having guessed that day, when she was activated first, everything was exactly as it was this time. "That's the axis, my strength is strong," Zeke thought to himself. Zeke jumped back sharply from the mosquitoes to avoid the remaining attacks. Zeke, with inconspicuous humility, was diligently preparing for the attack, intending to test his armor. Komaka gave Zeke a hard blow, but he was able to block him in time. Zeke immediately tried to block Komaka's forceful blow, protecting himself from her attack with all his might. After this, Zeke launched a counterattack, hitting the Komaka with great force, directing all his anger at this final blow. The glove, endowed with the power of a penguin, easily washed away the opponent's tension if Zeke was sane, asking Fred to stop the coma on him. It is clear that the glove is designed to reduce the strength of the enemy by attacking in a coma to put an end to the threat. The mosquitoes began to buzz loudly, creating a tense atmosphere to themselves, which only added to the threat of the situation. Then the mosquitoes began to fly one by one, silent in two forces, ready to fight in a fierce battle. "Zeke!" Fred shouted loudly, applauding him for the new one, watching out for how he was approaching a coma. Komaka continued to beat Zeke, but was not ready to give up, realizing that she needed to deal more blows. Because the moment you reach boundaries, you can activate your power. He did not hesitate and continued to attack the Komaka, believing that the skin blow was approaching him to force, regardless of the constant attacks from his side. Fred began to run to Zeke, his enemies with incredible strength and vivacity, which defied the message of the most experienced warrior. He could not believe, like Zeke, unfazed by all the blows, having continued to stand on his feet and fight, not giving up to attack, like an invincible skeleton in the middle of a storm. Having gained victory over the Komaks, Zeke and Fred sensed new strange sounds coming from the beast. "As soon as the stink ends," Fred said with a laugh at the accusation, and Zeke and he are preparing for a new attack. A liana began to descend from above, a crooked path ahead of them, a silent natural barrier that stepped forward to their hand. "If you fight, I will cover your back," having watched Fred looking at Zeke. Zeke thanked Fredov for support, and relying on his strength, moved forward, ready to counter the threat. After this, Zeke immediately began to attack, not hesitating to attack, concentrating on the goal and not giving himself time to doubt. He continued to attack without ceasing, and his blows were precise and swift, but he didn't feel the same. Like a rapt, the liana grabbed Zeke by the leg, sharply squeezing his arms and pulling him to the ground, a silent, invisible force that was holding him in place. At that moment, Fred, with a sword in his hands, rushed to Zeke, waving it in the wind to cut the vine. Fred quickly released Zika from the entwining vine, and that one, relieved, yapped him for turning, informing him that those close to him were about to fall into the pasture. But at that moment, when Zeke got away, the mosquito attacked him again. She quickly approached, trying to get back to the blow, while Zeke was busy with Fredov's work. Komaka grabbed Zika's hands, lovingly hugging him, and began to pull her mouth towards his face. That Zeke, having gathered all his strength, abruptly escaped from her grasp, concentrating the energy in his hand, and his eyes lit up with determination. Afterwards, Zeke hit the ball with force, directing all his concentrated energy into one miserable blow. After a forceful blow, the lump fell to the ground without a trace. Her body became indestructible, and Zik, standing on the ground, breathlessly died, but with the help of his eyes. Then he made a sharp move with his feet on the ground and flew up to the wind above them. "Fred, be careful there. Ahead of his Zik, we become unwary." After Zeke had collected all of his strength, activating the wild fist technique, his hand glowed with energy until he flew straight down to the bottom, a direct and miserable attack right on the Komaka. His speed and strength transformed him into the right element, and when he hit, the shockwave blew the lump away. The ground trembled due to the intensity of the attack, and as it shook, it drank, in which there is nothing complicated, having washed Zeke with a laugh at the accusation. While Zeke and Fred were working with Zeke's new incredible forces, in the shadows, on a distant hill, they kept watch over them. The stranger began to speak raptly, his voice becoming low and cold. After these words, the stranger descended from the hill right in front of them to the ground. Zeke and Fred, respectfully watching out for the stranger, exchanged glances, wondering who was guilty and what they wanted. What did they think of me? "I was just amazed at you, because everything was so fussy I couldn't help myself," said the unknown woman. Unknown, without depriving him of choice, believed that the stinkers would be with her. Or there will be a different choice in them, death by their hands. Like a raptum, the Komaka, who was lying behind the unknown woman, began to break in. After this, the cat began to scream loudly, and the sound was shrill and ominous. Komaka Mitevo attacked, but unknown, without hesitation, she hit her with her hammer. The forceful blow of Mitevo released energy, and the Komaka began to burn, her body ignited from the internal fire. "Call on me to swing the hammer as all the contestants scatter, and you brave guys," said the unknown woman. After that, she insisted that she again practice with her, which is what they deserved. As soon as you know that so many people will go through so many contestants, she thought that it would be much simpler. Fred thought about it. Even if it was a small matter, there would be more chances and it wouldn't sound like a bad idea. That Zik was so unimpressed and immediately began to wonder, without even thinking, calling her aunt. Those who Zik called the unknown woman auntie even shook her. Her face twisted with anger, and the veins on her forehead began to protrude, pulsating with tension. "Where are your manners, lad?" She washed away, irritated by the stream. After these words, the unknown woman hit Zik with great force with her hammer, hoping to kill him with one blow, but Zik immediately blocked him. Their attack did not stop anything that was already bothering them, and they could not understand it like that. Zik only laughed, remaining calm, but internally feeling tense, and he couldn't understand what that was all about. After this, Zik began to attack them even more, loudly sarcastic comments and mocking. Vaughn, cut to the brim, gave another strong blow with a hammer. This time the blow was even harder, and it seemed that it could damage the defense. "It's so careless to approach my attacks, the need to give me the heat," the unknown woman thought to herself. After the unknown woman tried to give another blow, Zik quickly reacted, grinning at the hammer. As Zik managed to escape the blow, he quickly succumbed to the moment, and with all the force he hit her in the living, the blow was so intense that the unknown woman felt pain. After Zik's heavy blow, the stinks immediately dispersed from one side to the other, giving themselves an hour to renew. "How are you going to make me sick, and why have you given up on me as your colleague?" Zik said with a laugh. The unknown woman, having regained a little strength, began waving her hand in the wind, expressing her frustration. After these words, she slammed her hammer hard on the ground, and the ground began to tremble under her blows. After such a pressing gesture, Zik began to feel nervous. After she hit the ground hard with her hammer, the unknown woman took a fighting stance, ready for an offensive attack. "I'll teach you some manners right now," she said. The unknown woman laughed. Her appearance seemed to be reasonable, and she was about to begin to understand Zika's fighting style. The unknown woman noticed that Zika has one petty streak. After she realized Zika's weakness, the unknown woman began to attack. Vaughn hit Zik with all her might with her hammer, and the ground shook with the force of the blow, but Zik immediately reacted and managed to block the hammer with his hands. Blocking such a strong blow was very difficult for Zik. His hands shook with the force of the blow, and his skin strained painfully, almost like a hammer. "It's a shame to lose strength, as it's mean," she said with a laugh, wary of how Zik was about to stream her blows. If the stranger was stuck, as much as Zik could still sink, he continued to attack. After several continuous attacks, the stranger began to grind. She raised the hammer until it burned out, preparing for the last final blow. She couldn't believe that the stench just started beating, and then they started screaming. Having already begun to choke, his body was covered with sweat, and he could not understand what he needed. The unknown woman did not hesitate and continued to attack him, and the blows became more and more merciless. Why is this lady so strong? Zik thought to himself, trying to get back together. After several attacks, Zik gained respect for her hammer, noting that he had become richly larger, but earlier it seemed that the hammer was charged with new power, its size and strength had grown, and it struck again more careless. The unknown woman looked at her and couldn't believe what she had noticed, and was surprised that Zik had reacted so quickly to the change of her hammer. Then she explained that her hammer had become larger due to the intensity of the fire. In addition, as the resonance of the blow grows, the hammer becomes much larger than before, and its fire becomes hotter. Each blow increases the size and intensity of the fire, transforming the hammer on the right. Halfway, let's not spend everything on our way. After that, as the hammer became even larger and stronger, she raised it up, ready for the final blow, and said that there was still more in it. This hammer is the possession of a flamethrower, with the sure ability to create intense flamethrower attacks. Zik can't seem to know and won't be able to believe it for a long time. After this, Mitevo gave Zika another miserable blow. The blow appeared incredibly intense. The heat had soaked up everything, and Zik, having accumulated excess strength, was finally trying to escape and protect himself. There was snow on the edges, and his mitten was gradually bursting with cracks. He was thrown back, but he could barely stand on his feet. The force of the impact was so great that deep cracks appeared on the ground. However, Zik noted another alarming detail, the hammer, which in the face of the blow became significantly larger, swelling in threatening dimensions. And Zik immediately realized that if I were to be given one more blow by such a majestic hammer, this would be the end for me, and I would end up in another world. Even though Fred was tempted by such an unconvincing turn and incredible force of blow, Zik's legendary glove could not withstand such mischief. Yogo was also struck by the fact that, holding such a majestic hammer, he handled it in such a way as a very small toy, with absolutely no respect for his mind and size. Fred is convinced that if the situation continues to develop in this manner, then Zik will inevitably lose. "You're really cool. I didn't think that you could survive the next attack, but now you're becoming more and more like me," said the unknown woman. After all, she began to stop, and even if she could continue, with great confidence in the death. I was shaking on my feet, having realized such a proposition, and was categorically not going to hesitate. The unknown woman got angry not at the heat, at the one who respected that there is a limit to everything, but also to her patience. Zik didn't want to spread the rumors, telling her to shut up and continue chewing. From these words, veins appeared again on their face, showing their disconnection. Vaughn raised her hammer and assumed a fighting stance, ready for another attack. After which she swung sharply and began to prepare for an offensive attack with a look of renewed determination. After which she hit Zika with her technique, releasing a burst of burning half, as if the Mitevo had buried him. Seeing such a scorching heat, Zik's gloves fell apart into little pieces that could not withstand the extreme temperature. Fred and the penguin began to scream in panic, but they were hopeless and did not know how to stop this destructive attack. Fred rushed to the phoenix with groans to help, but he believed that Zeke could figure everything out on his own. Penguin said that we can't help because our tummy hurts and we can't work in such a situation. And I was ahead of my guilt, and the stranger said, having died down. Vaughn also stated that she had lost interest until then and would not continue to chew on the sensation any longer. Zik, breathing heavily, having washed out, "It's not over yet and we need to get ready before continuing the fight." The unknown woman was wary, but did not understand her words and did not know what was on her mind. Black energy began to envelop Zeke, creating a dark cowlick around him, which fluttered behind his skin. The energy began to drain from all strength, tarnishing the excess middle. Black energy began to flow from the penguin, and he did not understand what was happening. "Now I'm using my power without power," the penguin thought to himself, feeling how his energy flows in and out. At that hour, black energy consumed the entire center around Zik, depriving itself of the darkness and chaos that the grandfathers had endured. Then from this black energy, a majestic black dragon appeared, manifesting incredible strength and darkness. Fred and Phoenix were amazed and shocked by what they had seen before them, after which the black dragon let out a strained cry that spread throughout the entire forest and continued to accumulate energy, which gradually became more and more amazing. Noticing how black energy began to spread throughout the entire forest, the contestants became wary, sensing the growing danger. The smells could not understand what was behind the wondrous noise, but the sound of it sent shivers down their skin, screaming out a sense of alarm. This revealed an extremely intense spiritual energy that filled the space, screaming out of fear. Everyone was feeling tired and anxious, trying to eat, and this energy took over. Some tried to follow her lead, while others, sensing fear, tried to flee. But no one could forget what this mysterious dark energy was, which seemed to be a small, inescapable force that was calling out to untransmitted sounds. The dragon, a creation with the dark energy of the penguin, began to grow in size until it became incredibly majestic, barking at everyone with its power. The unknown woman had a lot of dead, and she couldn't understand the thirsty word. In the middle of this majestic dragon with dark energy can be seen a spherical bar where Zik was located. Fred reported to his ears that he was trying to stop him, trying to bring him to you. That dragon opened its paw, in which another ball began to form, which gradually turned into dark energy, molding everything to itself. Fred firmly said that she needed to get out of the way. If the unknown was in ruins, she didn't know how she could get away from something so greedy and unsatisfactory. She was absolutely screaming that everything would disappear, even though the situation seemed hopeless. And at that hour the energy continued to accumulate in the dragon's mouth, becoming even thicker and tighter, ready to burst at any moment. Fred and the unknown woman stood dumbfounded, not knowing what to do next. Like a phoenix, he cut sharply on Fred's shoulder, after which the phoenix rose from my shoulder and flared up its mighty wings, flying straight to the dragon. Having risen up the mountain, high above the dragon, looking around and searching, Zik himself is known. After getting into the place where Zik was located, the phoenix quickly straightened up to the dragon, and the mute, half-blown windmill began to break through its solid body. Tim himself bursting through the body of the dragon, the phoenix robbing the great spirit. At that hour, Fred and the unknown woman stood in complete shock, not believing their eyes, not understanding that they themselves were in danger. And the phoenix began to fly near Zik's body, vibrating in the brightness of the half, which was gradually filling the expanse, bursting with dark energy, and creating paths to his escape. After whose dragon began to bloom, its majestic body gradually disintegrated into pieces, like a dark gloom, dissipating only a few excesses of dark energy around itself. When the dragon began to glow, Zik began to fall down, and steadily falling, Zik hit the ground with his whole body. While Fred was praising the phoenix for his excellent work, the unknown woman could not contain the joy that she was able to experience, feeling how tense she knew, and her heart began to beat calmly again. "What kind of power is this?" Fred chuckled, not looking at the sight of Zika, who was lying on the ground. At that hour, Zik himself lay unconscious. His body was intact, and his face did not show any sign of emotion. After an hour, Zik woke up, and after cuddling the penguin on his knees, marveled at the new one and chuckled, so as not to bother with him. Zik chuckled at why he himself, but the penguin was simply complimenting him. After what, Zik asked who still won in this fight. Fred is happy, hoping that Zik will spill the beans. Zik still couldn't comprehend what had happened, but at that moment he was tapped on the shoulder. There was no stranger, but she didn't care about the heat, and started to joke around, so she didn't really notice anything like that. "What the hell, why is this aunt not in the grave yet?" Zik jumped up and shouted. The unknown woman began to laugh at the fact that everyone was talking so much about her. While the stinks were hanging out there and barking one after another, Fred could not calm down. He was worried about Zeke. It's not even that Zeke has stumbled into trouble, but everything else. But what happened after he wasted money? You just can't wrap your head around it. However, Zik did not understand what had happened, and it was extremely difficult for him to find out what had happened. Fred couldn't believe that Zik didn't remember anything, and then began to cheat himself, thinking that he himself was the cause of the tragic incident. However, Fred calmed him down, singing that it's not good to rush through it. Fred believes that it would be better for Zika not to know the details, but rather to try hard to guess what really happened. The unknown woman pleased to forget about this, adding that the fact that he had developed it in everyday life should not be bothered by his cruelty. Zik began to attack the rematches, but at the end of the day she laughed no more because of her obsession. Zik began to get angry, and without moving away, said that there was no singing, and there was a woman who started crying, marveling at her meat. These words made her angry, and she said out of anger she began to prepare to hit him. While the stinkers were making noise among themselves, one of the contestants was watching them from the side. After about an hour of the stench, everyone sat down to supper at once. Penguin, with a rapt-like murmur, respectfully marveled at the stranger's bird. She also noticed his glance and looked at the penguin in amazement. Before speaking, "I wonder why children like you want to become contenders," the unknown woman asked with Sikavist. Alfred could not explain, and even often there was no choice between the family's business, and he simply continued to live in the right of his relatives. And for Zik, this will be a great chance to change his unhappy lot and decide to get out of what oppressed him. Dunno wondered what happened to Zik's family. Zik sharply confirmed that there is no family in him, and a few minutes later he stopped thinking about it. When he was very young, his father died, and from then on he was left alone, without the support of his homeland, to cope with all the difficulties of life on his own. And although I was still small, I had already realized the importance of spending, which took away a deep trace from my life. And at that moment, he decided to himself that he would earn everything that was lying around in order to live in this cruel world and not let the circumstances spoil himself. Once and again, change your share, make sure that you are building on more, the lower one allows the minute. The unknown woman noted how Zik began to load through it. His appearance darkened from important conjectures and thoughts. "My God, how amazing is this! I'm so touched," she said with laughter in her voice. Knowing about all his difficulties, she could not believe that he had gone through this journey himself, with such a young woman. She was proud of him, impressed by his flamboyance and strength of spirit. He asked her not to worry about him, and even said it seriously, and all his words came from the depths of his soul. He is guilty of reaching the 9th gloomy floor and going to heaven at any cost, not caring about all the difficulties and obstacles that stood on his path. Clenching his fist with renewed vigor, he declared that he would become the ruler of the heavens. The stranger was captivated by his words. Even though she didn't believe that he wanted to change his lot so much, she was struck by his determination and stubbornness, as if she didn't realize much in such a young person. After that she kissed, she knows what to talk about the other world, and she is ready to face all her secrets and dangers. But the problem is that this legend is already 500 years old, and no one can say for sure what part of the truth is in it. And during this great period, no one was able to spend it there, in the senses, on their own, and she added that even though they were dead, they had lost their lives. Immediately the stench rises to another floor, and the closer the stench comes to you, the more doubts and fears they have, and their skin brings them closer to the unknown. It's true that Zik will not go as far as Prague, but he can still change this world, and even his courage and daring actions can awaken changes that will be small, but important. These words certainly embarrassed Zik, and even made him doubt his own abilities and believe that he could really change things more seriously. "Why did you become a contender?" Fred chuckled at her, not understanding why she wanted to take on such responsibility that she herself doubted success. The moment she began to speak, the unknown woman's eyes became rapt white, mute due to shock or internal tension, and her gaze became penetrating, important for comfort. After which she just fell soundly asleep. All the emotions and stress that had accumulated had worn out her bed so that she couldn't stream anymore. He tried to figure out what had happened to her, but then his own eyes began to turn white, and when he realized how an invisible force was burying him, he closed himself off and fell into silence. After which Zik fell in charge of her and the penguin. He was mute under the influx of unconscious strength, also falling asleep, aware of his body relaxing and losing touch with reality. When the stinkers fell asleep, a little boy began to strip them. He clapped his hands and was glad that his plan had been decided upon, and everything went according to the planned scenario. As I thought, the drug that I had prepared appeared with a hostile effect, causing them to fall asleep and put them into a state that allows me to control the situation. As Fred spoke in a raptum behind, he had not fallen asleep because there was no soup and no wine, because it seemed that the smell was too strange and unnatural, and that made him wary. The boy stood up and looked at Fred, whose eyes were filled with fear and the confusion of what was about to happen. "What kind of drug is this?" Fred asked sternly. After that there was a laugh, but there was nothing good. There was nothing good. There was still evil. After that, he began to boast that everyone no longer realized that he was considered to be a contender, and therefore he was able to understand such speeches as this drug, its effects, and everything that comes along. The boy was suddenly angry at him, after which the boy reached his hand to the slingshot, which was behind him, ready to defend himself, even realizing that the situation was getting out of control. "Then you get out and have no other choice but aim straight at Fred." Then he fought with Fred, and then easily evaded the attack, already transferring this power and ready for any action. In other words, in one stroke, Fred fell down behind the boy, whose hands were so smooth and precise that he couldn't understand what had happened. At his screams, Fred simply sighed and laughed nervously. "Don't let anything pass in peace," Fred thought to himself. When the stench kicked in, Zik was out of anger, his eyes burning with anger. We don't understand how we dare to pump them with drugs, and obviously we want to steal their money, using their hopelessness as their advantage. Having started to cook it, it was so small that it turned out to be a real theft. After the stench began to resemble one another, the verbal attacks became more intense, and the tension between them grew with every word. While the stench was cooking, Fred quietly and discreetly took the boy's purse. And I got a lot of different pills and drugs there. That boy, having finished, Fred took his purse and started screaming so that he wouldn't touch anything there. Fred chuckled, having earned everything himself, to which the boy confirmed his words, looking more and more nervous. Fred was surprised that everything was torn apart by the child. It was as if behind them they began to scream, straining their throats, but a shadow appeared in front, as if it was the size of an oven, making them realize that something incredibly large and unsafe was pressing on them. But turning back, the stink smelled the little bird, as it seems there is nothing small sleeping in the majestic shadow. "Competitors, kindly let this child go. They are in my place and we can't use our strength," crying, said the bird. Her voice was filled with anxiety and pity. He walked this entire route on his own without any help. That boy himself started crying when he shook his little bird, and his tears brought more relief and money. And the little bird continued to cry, marveling at him. "Didu." The boy washed his eyes with tears, his voice drowning in emotion. Zik didn't understand why the boy was crying because he was weak, and Fred laughed awkwardly. "I'm so crazy," the unknown woman said, hitting her chest. After which she took that lad in her arms and declared that they were now brothers and would collapse at once. While Zik was angry, Fred said it was not a bad choice. The unknown was full of determination and ease, her eyes were burning, and she was ready to do everything in order to know the essence of the tree at once. At that hour, as the buds began to sap, the boy began to laugh and giggle ominously. After which everyone at once relaxed into the white riches, sparkling with the warmth of the half, and seemed to be hanging out under the bright sky. The dawn of the morning and the unknown, due to the resolve and intensity, energetically began to wake everyone up, calling for new arrivals and the beginning of a new day. Step by step everyone began to throw around, stretching and wondering. One of them, Zeke, was still sleeping soundly, and the unknown woman wanted to wake him up, and she called his name several times, but Zeke stubbornly did not want to give up. "Don't you want to get up, do you?" she said with a grin, giggling and looking slyly at him. After that, the hot lady raised her hand, trying to lightly hit him on the shoulder so as to stop him from taking a nap. After which she uncontrollably hit him hard with her elbow, trying to wake him up the rest. Then she hurriedly added that everything was fine, and there was nothing terrible, the stinks could be created. At the same time, Fred and the boy stood on guard, shocked by the bastards. Vaughn, full of enthusiasm, laughed and said that now her party is definitely losing the right sense of usefulness. Vaughn, overflowing with energy, insisted on continuing the game, aka Fred of the situation, having tried supinitis and even one of the gravest injuries. The stinkers turned around and looked at Zeke, who was still kicking in his mouth. After which she grinned. She wanted to show that it was not her fault, and she had nothing to do with it. A year later, the stench had already settled in the very heart of the forest roots, and the trees became larger and larger, and now thicker and more mysterious. The stinks were already fighting with the contestants, their blows sounded in the quiet forest, and the skin ruffled with renewed resolve. The stranger, with a loud scream, hit one of the contestants with all her strength, whose body shook under the blow. Both Zeke and Fred also did not stand up, having immediately entered the battle, forcing heavy blows from them, not giving their opponents any chance of victory. Fred was preparing for the attack, and his sword touched the chambers and brightened the half-jam of energy that had erupted from him. At this moment, one of the contestants began to attack him. Alfred Mitevo reacted, blocking the blow and defeating the enemy with an energetic burst that escaped from his sword. At that hour they began to attack from behind. Znenatska wanted to miss the attack, having missed the blow on the surface. Fred turned back and shook the satisfied boy, who, holding his small roller in his hands, began to attack. "Are you really thinking that I don't know what you're up to?" The evil contestant, coldly washing, appeared unsuspectingly behind the lad, shuddering at him in front of the unsuited woman. After these words, they swung their arms forcefully, intending to give the boys a miserable blow, which would make it impossible to escape. When the boy was already preparing to take the blow, Zik appeared in a rapt and stopped the attack, masterfully transferring the blow with his hand into his mittens. After this, Zik, not missing a second, followed with a hard blow. After which, of course, we begin to prepare for the ultimate blow, which could put a speck in someone's life. Unwillingly, Zik gathered all his strength and gave the contestant a miserable blow right in his face, causing him to fall to the ground. The boy paid his dues for those who lied to him because of his unsafe situation and ruined his life. "Take care, we are now comrades, having washed Zik." The sadly silent unknown woman said that the stench had stopped. Standing on the bodies of the already overcome contestants, she with cold singing respected that the singing was not a problem. More and more applicants appeared, and this meant that the survival program was approaching its finish line, leaving the strongest little chance of winning. Everyone began to fight vigorously. They had lost all hope, and now they were ready for anything, or to choose their chance for a better life. Phoenix Ruin, Frida and the bird Ariel, strangers, were extremely tired of such merciless battles. Their strength may have been exhausted. The unknown woman and Frida carefully lifted them into their arms, gently stroking them, and told them that they should enjoy the threes and deserve it. After this, the birds began to fly brightly. Their wings glowed with golden light, so that the sky was filled with too much space. Then the bodies of Frida and the strangers were dismantled. The birds deprived themselves of only the brightest trace of energy. The two penguins were hostile to the boys. Their eyes opened wide in shock, and they could not understand what had happened. "Mr. Bird of the Soul, without knowing that you can break up with your partner's body and prefer?" The unknown woman began to feel happy, looking at him. Whether Zik or penguin, the stench was absolutely not a little thirsty. As we walked, their looks were completely unreasonable, and their heads were spinning without power. After this, Fred, noting that he was relieved, began to explain what had happened. But he himself doesn't know why, but if the stinks became partners, they could share their life force one with one, just as the birds of the soul can fall in love with their bodies. After which Zik shut up and began to think about his words. That time, in the hour of battle, he forgot at this moment, even if he was concentrating on living, but at the same time, after having thought about everything, he began to sing that they could do it themselves, share strength, and fall in love. Zik can't understand why the penguin doesn't know what to do, but the penguin, smiling and walking around, is ruined, starting to act stupid. That Zik got angry with him and asked him not to behave like that, even if he was a completely different character. "Before speaking, we have a small problem. I don't drink the essence of the tree," said the unknown woman, looking around. She marveled at everything, examining the bundles of skin, but still could not identify the essence of the tree. All the girls stood frozen in thought, but Zik could not calm down, having continued to hang out with the penguin, why he should not enter his body. That penguin stated that if he entered Zika's body, he could not eat meat, and this was a serious problem for him. "Possibly up there. Look up," thinking Frida. The rest also began to think about this word, and their gaze reached to the top. It was bright on the mountain, which increased her respect. Fred began to explain that he had thought so, because it was the same place, but they were not surprised at the stink. And other contestants, with great probability, do not know how it is. They have already exhausted all possible options, and of course the light on the mountain was the only reference point they had lost. The fragments in them, however, there was no other choice. The stinks were about to fall there. All the clothes were useful, of course. What could be their remaining hope? Having called out to their bird souls, the stinks disappeared and began to fly to the mountain. When the stinks flew up, Fred raptly noted the strangeness of the enemy, shouted, and marveled there. The color of tree roots was different, not the same as in all other places. After the sick person recovered, those who got sick ended all his recovery. But the guy is primitive, but that's not all. You can also note that trees have a lot of new nutrients. In other words, there is a high probability of stinking in one place. Then, with a rush of stench, they sensed a wondrous sound emerging from the depths, and they began to sharply mutter. In the roots of the trees there were vines that looked as if they were alive, and they were trimming their branches, ready to attack. After hearing the stench, they realized that it was pasta, and they started to roll around. Until they realized the stench, the vines on the vines had already begun to attack them. The vines, our snakes, began to collapse, releasing fire arrows from the vines that flew straight into their back. They were attacked from all sides with the skin touching. The danger was getting closer and closer. There was an incredible abundance of animals. Their diversity and variety were impressive. But it was impossible for them to flow out of such a majestic amount of armor that had flowed from their sides. Fred, without expressing his emotions, shouted loudly and immediately began to prepare for the attack. He quickly and masterfully repelled all attacks, not giving any chance to break through the defense. The unknown woman, without giving up, began to repel the attacks, fighting with her fiery hammer. He too did not rise. His eyes burned, and he attacked, releasing the wisps of his dark energy. Fred, not caring about the baked battle, showed respect to the unknown and tisked at his figure, and Vaughn, a little shocked by his turbo, laughed and said, sensing the unexpected warmth in his words, "Alvona sang to Yogo that everything is fine with her, and that you don't want to get into trouble. In all these drops, this is a good sign, and the fact that there is so much pasture here means that the essence of the tree is definitely found here itself." Before the speech, I think we forgot someone, having washed, guessing Zeke. They suddenly realized that they had forgotten Dean. At that hour, Dean, not expecting any help, turned in the other direction and gave in to them. Having known where the essence of the tree was found, it would not be difficult for him in such a situation to be deprived of them. The bird is happy, and even now the smells will become rich, whose eyes shone from the burial, because they understand that with the tree's seedlings, their life will change radically. He proposed to take the entire essence and sell it to other competitors, even if they were not in heaven. At that moment, Dean felt bad for Zika, even having lost his life and having suffered himself. And in a second the whole sum went down, when Dean thought that Zik himself was to blame for the one who had been deceived, after which the stench was strong enough to drink and not waste an hour in vain. Like a raptum, Dean turned around and hit his leg. "Who is blocking my way?" Dean shouted angrily, his voice shrill and aggressive. When Dean raised his head, he saw in front of him the great and evil man, who stood massive, and when he denounced him, he became harmless, and there was anger in his eyes. This man got really angry and started to be rude to Dina, whose voice was rude and aggressive. At that hour, Zik and Rashta were chewed by Dina's jokes. As if in a tumult, the Stinks looked around and shook the beaten Dean, standing, leaning on his sides. His exposure was overcome by pain, and his clothes were stained with blood. After which, Dean, unable to bear the pain, having fallen out of strength and losing his nerve, his body haplessly fell to the ground, and everyone completely fell silent. "So whose name is this guy Dean?" I turned to him for information. Otherwise, without feeling his name, I washed the man. He stood proudly in front of everyone, and a sly and self-satisfied smile shone on his face, which further reinforced his boldness and boastfulness. Zik's anger exploded, and with a cry he asked for what he had made from it, his voice trembling in a storm. However, this man looked at him with obvious irritation and chuckled coldly, whom they mentioned to him. I was very pleased with Dean, even though she, without saying anything important, asked in a sharp voice what the essence of the tree was. Vin said that if they reveal this information, then Den will lose his life. Vin disrespectfully placed his foot on Dean, and this sight inflamed Zeke's anger to the brim. Zik and I angrily told him to take his leg from Dean, whose voice rang out in a storm. The raptum of the essence, which everyone was so eagerly joking about, reluctantly made itself known with mysterious sounds that spilled out all over, twisting the respect of the skin. One of the contestants raptly pointed his hand upward to the man, insisting that obviously the essence was there itself. Essentia felt the brightness of the light, as if everything was blindingly looming around her, turning to look at itself. This man sharply declared that there was no longer a need to arrest anyone. Like a rapist, one of the contestants sharply attacked Zik, indicating his rudeness with an attack. Vin Mitevo attacked Zik with an attack, only to lose himself indestructible, not reacting to aggression. After which, with one pressing blow, Zik threw him back, forcing the contestant to step back. The man, having finished, became angry and clenched his teeth against the rot. "You will die in my hands," singing Zik, marveling right in the eyes of your rival. Other contestants rushed to the one whom Zik had hit, trying to help him get up. They were incredibly angry with Zik, and even could not understand how they would dare to hit their comrade. After this, the Stinks all attacked Zik at once, intent on taking revenge on him for his work. Then Fred and the unknown woman met in front of Zik, ready to kidnap him and help defeat the attack. After this, Fred and the unknown woman began to fight, throwing back and forth blows at the contestants who were trying to take revenge on Zik. Unknown and Fred were seriously trained, their eyes showed determination, they were ready for any action to protect their comrades from the attackers. That man, having finished, only laughed, nothing serious had happened, and continued to guard against the sneering expression of denunciation. It was so funny to me that he would play with them, start teasing and try their powers, otherwise there would be some kind of game. Vin began pointing his finger at them, laughingly, punishingly attacking at once. So many others were in trouble because of such impudence. The stink of his puppet is silent. "I'm sorry, it looks like not everything is okay with you." the unknown woman shouted, after which she attacked him without attack. She attacked him with all her strength, but she calmly stopped her blow with one hand, otherwise it was just a fight. Vona couldn't believe her eyes, not realizing how he was able to launch her hard attack with one bare hand without showing much effort. That Fred, without wasting an hour, immediately rushed into the attack, pointing his sword straight at him, hoping for an effective blow. That man easily ducked under the blow, but there was an initial test before he could overload. And at that hour Zik raptly attacked the beast, trying to hit the man with an unbearable blow. You hit his head with force, hoping to kill your opponent with one hard blow. Zik was wary, and even unfazed by his hard blow, the man did not take away the pain, and he was sick. After which the man activated his power and released a powerful bolt of lightning, which quickly rushed through the wind, heading straight for Zik. There was a shock that the blow was not delivered, but at the same time he noticed that the man's hand was completely covered with an electric charge, which was floating in the wind, ready for an offensive attack. After which the man, vicaristically with his charged hand, hitting them with all the force, vibrating a pressing electric pulse. And the stench tried with all its might to rub on its feet, struggling with the power of lightning, so as not to be carried away by the forceful blow of the electric charge. When the flow of lightning ended, they all withdrew with relief and began to rehydrate, trying to renew their strength after a tense shutdown. Zik could not believe that this man had so easily dissipated them without making any special effort, leaving them with enemies and stronger ones. Isn't he a monster? Zik thought to himself, trying to comprehend how such a tough and ruthless rival could so quickly turn their ears around. They all tensed up, having realized that this man had not yet shown his true strength. They knew that in front of them was a truly strong opponent with whom it would not be easy to fight. Zik immediately declared that the Stinks would take away the essence of the tree and move forward. And you will have to deal with this man yourself. You don't doubt your duty to get in touch with him while everyone else is crumbling away. What are you saying like that? You can't fight him one-on-one, the unknown woman shouted sharply, obviously not agreeing with Zik's plan and complaining about his safety. That Fred asked her to check. Vin can't believe that Zik is going to win for just a few hours, and even if the stench doesn't bother the man, he risks wasting the essence of the tree. Therefore, aware of the seriousness of the situation, they began to listen to Zik and fall behind the tree, hoping that they could turn around immediately and not allow it to be wasted. Dunno, with worry in her voice, asked Zik to be careful, knowing that this supernik could be extremely careless. After which the Stinks opened their wings and, flapping them, rose up the hill, straight up to the essence of the tree. You don't have enough of a chance against me, the man slammed his hand against the tree. After whom, sparkles began to spread all over the tree, flashing on Fred's path and strangers, creating dangers and threatening their ruin ahead. But the stench did not manage to escape, and lightning struck them. A strong electric shock pierced their bodies, raging with incredible pain and pain. After which Zik shouted loudly, declaring that he himself was his real enemy, ready to meet him at the final battle. After that, Zik, having gathered all his strength, attacked him with a heavy blow with his black glove, directing all the energy to one point. That man stopped the attack with one hand, easily removed his glove, and mockingly called it a toy, not being aware of any threat from such a blow. After which, laughing, the man began to wrap lightning around Zik's hand, creating a powerful electric charge that began to penetrate into his body. Those beeps began to beat all over Zik's body, penetrating him from all directions, disturbing him to feel a burning pain and suffer equal pain under the blow of electric shock. After this, Zik fell to the ground writhing in pain. After which, Zik began to struggle to get up, his skin collapsed with great difficulties, and not knowing what to do next, feeling himself at the limit of his strength. Even if it were to lose its power, the forceful electrical charge would simply kill it, and this could be fatal. Therefore, Zik was hesitant to think of another plan, how to fight against this force, even if direct fight against the electric charge could lead to his death. Then Zik immediately noted that he was handing over a bunch of vines, and an idea popped into his head. At that time, the man angrily watched over Fred and the unknown woman, who all rose to the essence of the tree. After that, the man, having worked hard to shave the acne, moved Bliskavka, directing his strength in order to catch up with Fred and the unknown woman who had been trying to reach the age. While flying swiftly right up to them, the brisk flow of energy was mute, and Zika was ordered to scratch his cards. That Zik, not daring to let him go, clenched his teeth, tensed his muscles, and concentrating, began to prepare for the haircut in order to move the man in the wind. Zik tightly shaved off and gave the man a strong kick to the hip, daring him to change the trajectory of his flight and focus respect on him. Zik was a very lovable man whose face was filled with rot. The man was not annoyed that Zik appeared so stubborn and was not willing to give up at all, regardless of all attempts to destroy his spirit and physical strength. So the man heated up the heat, began to release powerful streams of energy directly into Zika, intending to infect him and the remainder of his support. That Zik, without even trying to escape, wrapped his hand in a liana, which helped it to strengthen, and with all his might, he tried to endure the intense blows of energy. The man could not comprehend that Zik himself was afraid. If you have recovered Zik, then you can bring lightning to yourself, and now you can absorb its power without problems. After that, Zik, having lost some of his strength, was preparing for the attack. After this, Zik gained maximum speed, and without hesitation attacked the man, directing all his strength into a pressing blow, ready to strike again and again. Zik hit with force on the face of the man. The pressing blow cut through the wind, and his hand hit straight to the target. From such a strong blow, the man's eyes began to bleed, and blood began to flow from his mouth, confining himself, feeling the pain pouring through his body. Zikbov seriously adjusted. "I will immediately dominate you," shouting Zik and hitting him in the face. The impact was so strong that the man flew several meters back. However, the man still managed to get to his feet, even though he was holding his back, having felt a significant blow. After that, the man, having gathered his strength, washed with ferocity, threatening Zik that he would die first. Zik did not lose his respect for his words, but now he has threatened him. After which, offended, they became angry, they shouted loudly and immediately attacked one another. Their attack struck in one blow, creating a powerful surge of energy that shook the earth. After this, Zik Mitevo attacked Yogo. Without wasting any pain, the skin was calculated and accurate. Then the man reluctantly began to attack the line, Zik, demonstrating agility and accuracy, easily escaping from the skin blow. After which Zik quickly hit him in the face with a hard blow, and in response the man Mitevo hit Zik in the stomach. Zik began to attack again. His blows were swift and accurate, but the man, having gathered himself, was able to effectively defend himself, knocking out a skin blow, not allowing Zik to break through his defense. In the face of such a strong blow, the man clenches his teeth, feeling how the pain penetrates into his body, spreading everywhere through the skin. This was a baked battle, a blow of great importance, a moment, a breath of great importance, even though what was at stake was not just physical life, but pride, determination, and anger to the top. The man began to get angry with Zik, his anger flaring up, and he became extremely stubborn and did not give up, even if the situation became more and more complicated. Vin disconnects, having begun to carry out a Bliskovich attack, releasing powerful streams of energy that cut through the wind, like the brisks. The skin blow of the blows was fierce and nugamous force. Having continued to chew the beats, not hesitating for a second, releasing new streams of flashes that tore through the wind, losing sight of the light and disintegration, whose attacks were unstoppable, the skin blow of the mutes straightened to Zika's decline. Screaming loudly, he continued to attack. His screams were mixed with the sounds of vibrations and flashes that erupted from his hands. The skin blow sounded like a vibration of energy that exploded the silence around. "Now you behave like a wild animal," having said Zik, his voice was calm, but in the new one there was a sharp humor. After which he sharply pulled back, twisting himself away from the line of attack. His move would be gentle and precise, with a unique blow, which would inevitably be ruinous. Having chuckled, he guessed who the denunciations were poured into his memory in such a situation. The man told Zika of 3 boys from the lower lands who were the ones who killed him. The man, it seems, has realized who he is talking about. His glance has become a little more respectful, and in his eyes he has lost recognition. Zik was surprised that the man knew who he was talking about, but didn't realize that anyone still knew these guys and those that happened that time, as if the unsatisfied people buried him. This means that you had lowered your eyes, washed your head, and in your voice there was bitterness mixed with hatred. It means that Zik was the same lad who caused harm to the lads in the lower lands, which was a real shock for him. Having never experienced such a reaction and experience, even not knowing that these guys were important to his opponent, without learning anything more from them, not just going to his own way, but for whom the stench of the man is obviously a little more significant. The man was even more angry, and even then Zik's stench could not rise above him. This anger was not without an image, and the disappointed stench crossed the reach of a great storm, but Zik had crossed him, depriving them of them. After that, having foretold that very day, Rosmov had a conversation with them, which deprived him of a deep trace of his memory, inspired by his hopes and ambitions. If they told you that they would soon turn around, and even in them they were right, they couldn't understand what would be their farewells, and they didn't understand that their words were the last sleeping moment, and their ways and their power will separate forever. He couldn't believe that they had gone to investigate the child, and this child was now standing in front of him. His eyes were aligned with Zeke, and he realized that in front of him was not just a lad, but the very reason that had not given him comrades. The chance is better than ever. After that, he raised his leg high above the ground, braced himself for a pressing blow, and washed so as not to beat him for what had happened. After that, he screamed loudly and hit the ground with his foot, screaming as the moon pierced the silence, and his anger burst into the wind like a flash. The blast filled the entire expanse, its glare and discharge hit the ground, and the pressing flow of energy began to beat Zeke. "Szwidzi, win Zishof's rozumu," Zeke shouted, brutalizing Fred and the unknown. It was not an easy task for them, but they were left with just a little bit, and the stink was almost over. That Zeke was unnerved, even within a short time before death. After which this man began to attack again. His disconnected blows carried in them all the power of evil and revenge. That wrapped him. His leg got stuck in the paste. The man slumped, not realizing such unrest. He started trying to get married to her, but nothing came of it. Behind him, Dean began to giggle, his laughter becoming both mocking and evil. Dean turned around. He walked up and rinsed off the wine. After which, Dean began to aim the slingshot straight at him. Having hit him right in the head, we began to beat his head. After this, all of us lit up around the man. At that hour, Fred and the unknown woman began to scream loudly, because the stench had taken over the essence. With the joy of this news, my heart was filled with relief, even though they had reached their mark, after which they hid Dina and began to flow. That man had no intention of letting them in. The electric tiger came to his senses, and a strong burst of energy burst out of its body, resembling a slender bright hut. After which the electric tigers began to appear, materializing from intense discharges as they ran straight towards Zik and Dina. He began to run incredibly fast, his feet stuck to the ground in the ice, and the darkness of the saw began to rise near him. Zik, having used all his agility and reaction, was able to escape the blow of one of the tigers. Without hesitation, he prepared for a new attack. When we saw the attack rosy, the man realized that Zik and Din had flowed in. His fierceness reached its peak, and he shouted loudly, not believing that the stinks could escape from him. At that hour, on the first floor of the grassy valley, they sat, slightly bowed their heads, and lost their senses. "I don't understand, there's nothing worthwhile here." "You yourself have started this game to survive for the heavenly door," Merlin said without understanding the judge. "It is obvious that without any hope, having damaged the essence of the tree through boredom, becoming daring and almost wanting to be boring in your monotonous sleep. Prot, regardless of the circumstances, all episodes of the game would have ended long ago." Merlin asked the court to make a pair, asking who, in her opinion, would finish first in this game. This proposition certainly struck a chord with the judge, even though he had always enjoyed gambling and the opportunity to try his luck. Merlin said she was going to place a bet on Greg's, even though she was reconfirmed that he was sure to become famous and make a name for himself in the future. However, judging by the changes in your life, you are aware that the money will immediately go to you. With a grin on his face, he declared that he would bet on Zik, respecting his favorite and the singing of his paramosis. To the one who dared to tell him directly in his face that he would become the ruler of heaven and that his greatness would be beyond reproach. Like a stench of stench, they sensed the booming voices that mooned the order, breaking up the silence and twisting their respect to the point that it had happened just before. We turned around, screaming loudly in the area. These were the rest, who obviously were extremely happy, even if they were the first to reach the mark, ahead of all others. Having sipped the essence in his hands, they could only detect the stench. The contestants who were present had different reactions. Some were glad for the victory, while others were shocked by such an unhappy result. And although I couldn't expect the incredible delay to my success, the sensations of excitement and disappointment, they could not believe in those who had lost to them, and through this they wasted their chance to rise to another level, where new possibilities were explored for them. One of them, without shaking off his emotions, hit the table out of anger, without breaking it, cracking and breaking into two parts. He explained that his nerves are at the boundary, and he can no longer handle such tension. "There are 3 fates rotting in this place. it is respectful that it is obligatory to allow them to rise, even though they deserve a chance for more. Others also rebelled, and some of them spent more time in this place, and there were so many people in the city that they could not tolerate it any longer. "What are you up to now?" making one of the contestants nervous, sensing that things are going wrong and the situation is becoming more and more tense. They ruled the rebellion, throwing out all the rules and ready to fight for their rights, which meant going against everyone. The competitor, having thought that the stinks have gone crazy, and even that they will go against the court, he will punish them without a doubt, and not just punish them, but most likely kill everyone who dared to repair the operation. One of the guards, sensing the noise, chuckled, wondering what was happening between the competitors and why there was such tension in the wind. One of the contestants who started a rebellion marveled at his new eyes, became angry. After which he, without expressing his anger, sharply rushed at the guard, launching an attack. With all his strength he hit the guard in the stomach with his sword. The guard fell unconsciously to the ground with a wound on his stomach, his body collapsed, and the blood began to flow freely to the ground. The other guards, who were watching the scene, became angry, and having pulled out their armor, were ready to take revenge for their comrade. But they didn't manage to do anything, as the competitors, the victorious ones, attacked them, trying to neutralize the guards before they could report. After which Theseus himself was killed with his head weapon. New motivations they gathered together, wanting to leave the rest of the Theseus in order to put an edge and bring justice with their own hands. At that hour, Theseus and Zeke, together with the rest, were already standing in the arena when the heavenly gates suddenly opened, which led to the offensive stage, raising them to a new level. The stinkers stood there, marveling one-on-one, after which Zik, having reached the court's essence, passed on to him those things that could change Zik's life. "I sing the songs that we have written all your mind so you won't ruin your clothes just because you are lazy," having chanted Zik. Fred began to try to calm Zeke down, noting that his tension could only aggravate the situation and that he needed to act more carefully. Fissy, with a laugh at the accusation, this time there was a renewal of energy and passion, promising to send them to the top. Physis was pleased that having won the bet, he felt that he had won, and Axis Malin, with disappointment, was afraid to recognize her defeat. Then he inserted his club into the center of the arena, and from its end, a spark of energy began to emerge, which filled the space around it, readying the gates to open. Then he put his hand to the club, concentrating all his strength to summon the energy necessary to open the gates and conquer his ritual. The power of Physis began to wrap around the club, and everything was filled with a bright light, which gradually became stronger. At this point, a great tree grew, its tree rising to the very sky, and its branches flared up like winds. From its top, a portal began to open, filling the expanse with a mysterious light. So the rest were shocked by such an incredible phenomenon, not realizing that everything would be so big and fast, and they watched in wonder as the portal opened up in front of them, bringing new possibilities. The portal kept expanding and expanding, becoming more spacious, its boundaries becoming larger and larger, and with each passing second gaining ever greater tension. It is clear that the portal has indeed been opened, not realizing that the decoration will be victorious on the table with such force. The unknown was glad that even if they decide to ascend to heaven, they feel that their meta-axis will be reached, and a new, spluttering stage of their journey will be revealed ahead. At that very hour she became wary, and even sensed that in heaven they might be wandering about unsafely, perhaps to disturb them, and shut up with new shouts, the stench of which could not be overcome. Fred was also wondering what the place was on top, even though he couldn't see what was waiting for them there, and what concerns or opportunities might arise in this new, unknown world. Al Yogo Phoenix is too confident that this place will not disappoint him, even though he has long been searching for new horizons and does not want his journey to end in failure, hoping for greater things nepred Bachuvain. A day later, Zika began to murmur under his nose. "Well, to be honest, there's less to get paid for," he muttered awkwardly, realizing that his words could be inappropriate, but still managed to figure out his getting paid. Alazik nodded to him with a gesture, even though he understood what he wanted to say, and not afraid to allow him to go into education, calmly washed that he didn't need to learn, and everything was in order. Dean was caught and didn't know what to say. Zik chuckled, and noting Dean's insignificance, calmed him down. For him it was a headache that everything ended well, and he sang to Dean so that he would not worry or think about it any more. These words made Dean angry, and he couldn't stop the tears. Tears flowed down his cheeks, and he began to cry for everything that Zik had earned for him. Penguin began to approach him, laughing and hot, that Zik, saying he was kind, and thus denouncing Zik's loveliness. His eyes burned, and he could not stop irritation like this hostile irony. After the stench began to boil, loudly expressing their irritation, and the situation became more and more tense, Fred unknowingly tried to stop them. Similar to those who smell happy, with a laugh at their appearance, they washed the judges, guarding their emotions. Alice, as only those who want to continue their words, rapped Castle, and from his guise there was a chuckle. Malin did not understand why, having left the judge, she guarded him with wonder, trying to understand what had caused such a rapt change in his behavior. Yak rapped Amachtos behind them, screaming loudly, screaming vimagingly. There were other evil contestants who could not pass the test. Their exposure was filled with anger, and dissatisfaction burned in the eyes of the mountains. They said that the judge was responsible for allowing them to go further, acting on their behalf, that their punishment was unfair, and they have the right to another chance. Malin got angry and, without losing her emotions, ordered them to sing quietly, her voice being firm and decisive. The contestant who initiated the rebellion could not believe what he sensed, and with a thunderous cry, he ordered the contestants to rush out of the court, Vimagayuchi, so that they would touch him without any hard work. All the contestants, gathered in one group, immediately rushed to the judge, running fast. Thus, the other participants lost their lives, not knowing what to do in this chaotic situation, and everything became so wrapped and unsatisfactory that they could not understand what to do next. Al-Malin, without wasting any time, decisively ordered the guards to carefully round up the contestants, making sure that they kicked in any attempts at handing over and brought the situation under control. However, the contestants, not giving up, began to attack the guards, trying to break through and not allow them to mess with their plan, violently attacking and fighting in order to clear their way. Malin, realizing that the situation was out of control, called out her power as a windbreaker, the strong wind burning around her, spinning everything in its direction. After this, Malin, without hesitation, regained her strength, directly blowing the evil wind directly at the contestants. If the contestants are not in the mood to give up, under the onslaught of the wind, the stench of the stench has realized that they are to blame for their food with Fissy, who has crossed their steps to rise to the top. Malin found herself in a hopeless situation. There were too many applicants, and her windbreaker power could not effectively take down everyone at once. She did not know what happened next. Judging by the little ones having guarded these troubles, they died heavily. After this judgment, without wasting an hour, calling out their power, mighty vines rushed out from under the ground and quickly wrapped themselves around him. From the vines a great monster began to form, creations of thick, intertwined leaves and corians, rising to its full height, majestic and terrible. The monster screamed loudly, its roar mooning, otherwise a storm, bursting into silence for a while, then raising one hand to the sky. After which the monster, having collected all its flesh, hit the ground with all its force. The blow's blow hit the writhing, trembling the ground, and the force of the blow of the contestants who stood nearby were thrown out and the sides scattered into pieces. Most of the contestants immediately lost their awareness of the force of the blow. Their bodies collapsed, fell powerlessly to the ground, and their bodies could not get up. The other contestants, who had become so hungry in appearance, could not control their panic. They were overcome with fear at the strength and greatness of the monster standing in front of them, and at the same time, how mercilessly they dealt with their comrades. At that hour, while the contestants were still in shock, the monster began to raise his other hand. The monster, having raised his hand, began to swing at other competitors. His arms were soft and tight. The competitors, not bothering any of them, began to rush forward into the massacre, trying to escape the terrible attack of the monster. The monster did not hesitate and continued to attack the competitors, its blows being accurate and merciless. The monster's blow was so hard that the ground under his feet began to scatter in all directions, silently tearing into pieces. "What is happening now?" Having said Zik, the voice of his voice was filled with fears and worries. Raising their eyes to the sky, the contestants began to stand in the middle of the monster, Phesis, whose figure was clearly visible among the intertwined vines and crowns that formed the body of the monster. Phesis was incredibly evil. His guise expressed anger, which may even go beyond the boundaries of the human, considering the contestants incredibly bad, because they didn't even know about the basic installation of testing. In any case, Thesis was reconciled that the contestants have no sense of rising after the fact that the Stinks became victims of his power, and he could not understand how the Stinks could dare to rebel against him. After which he took the essence in his hand. With incredible strength he began to squeeze it, and all his anger was concentrated in one person. After Thesis squeezed the essence with incredible force, she began to break out in anger. It shocked everyone present. The judges had to ruin their routine, but now, since everything turned out so crazy, they told them to just quit. And judging, we decided not to miss the hot contender for the next floor. After this judgment, the earth lost its strength, and the earth began to tremble and began to destroy everything. The earth under his feet split open, and the wind became strong due to stress. The vines that formed the monster's body began to spring up all over the place, rushing around with incredible force, wounding and killing the contestants who could not escape its onslaught. After this, the vines continued to bloom all over the place. The stench rose in wakefulness, entwining the walls, lamenting them, and enveloping the place into chaos. People cried, screamed, and asked for help. Their voices were lost in the midst of the roar of the ripped-off monster and the thousands of ruined bells. There were the most heartfelt cries of pain and pleas for help that pierced the silence drowned in the noise of the ruination. The patient began to see a cold pit in Zika's eyes, and his eyes widened with jaundice, standing stiffly, mutely paralyzed, not believing what was happening around him. Supinitse, having watched Zik nervously. After the hunger had recently reached its climax, Zik began to share stories from his childhood, when he was still small, and as if they were killing the villains through the seeds. Zik remembered the great pain he experienced that day. Zik, having foretold the death of his father, who had previously been a support and protector for him, on that day gave up his life in order to kidnap him, eagerly reinvestigating so that he could have a chance at redemption. Having guessed those who killed his father, and this clue was even crueler, their denunciations, a result of cruelty and cruelty, were lost in his memory forever. Zik, having respected this world with the unjust and the divine, the skin cramp, the skin struggle, seemed to me to be foolish. Even though Zik was going to change this world, he could no longer watch over how people suffer, how their lot and life are depleted, how this divine light is falling into abyss. Zik is ready to endure all the hell, not caring how much pain and suffering he will have to go through. After guessing, a new half of happiness, half of joy lit up in his eyes, seeing how his inner strength of determination had awakened, how the dark fire in his heart was kindled by the sparkling fire of courage. After his passion began to ignite, the light soared up the mountain, and he felt how his body was bursting with wind, how the skin was filled with the unknown energy that allows you to rush through space. Zik flew, without hesitation, right up to the face of the monster. The wind squeezed him, and his strength grew from his skin. Zik, do not back down, hitting with force in the guise of the monster. Why did I forget to say? Having watched the judge, you marvel at Zik with a cold gaze. And the judge repeated that he believed that none of the contestants could pass. And Zik didn't want to hear anything. His respect was entirely focused on the matter, and the words of the judge were of no small importance. Ajay Zik was here for the sake of the judge's ability to stream his word. Do you really want to become stronger for the sake of additional wrath? Watching over the battle, the penguin thought to himself. Whatever you want is possible. After which the penguin said to Zik, so that he would concentrate his strength on his hands, and at that very hour of violence. Zik could not understand what he himself was talking about, but the penguin politely asked him to work, explaining what his instincts tell him that he himself must immediately work. Zik Vikanav those who said the penguin, and then immediately tisked, and that everything must be done correctly, doubt their actions. Zik did not come to terms with the wondrous armor that appeared wrapped from his gloves, while he tried to understand how they were fighting, judging by the fact that they were already ready before the attack, approaching with dangerous speed. The monster's hand suddenly rushed towards Zik, shaking gravely and grimly. Zik, without worrying, immediately gathered up a new armor and began to quickly knock off the monster's hand. Zik did not hesitate, attacking not just his hand, but the entire body of the monster, trying to find the weak spot. Simarna on the right, having respected the judge. However, Zik was not angry, and having collected all his strength, faced an even greater blow. NatoVP respectfully followed the curl of this baked battle, obscuring it. The stinkers could not shed their tears, even though standing in front of them was a completely different judge than the one they knew and respected. At this hour, Fred hastily led people out of this unsafe zone, trying to save more lives. Vin loudly shouted at Malin because she stood on the sidelines, keeping an eye on everything that happened, and didn't try to help lead people out of the unsafe zone. Vaughn became ruined and nervous and didn't know what to do next, even if she didn't refuse the necessary order from the court. Fred was incredibly overwhelmed, even though not the lives of many innocent people were at stake, but also the share of the entire place that could fall on the border of a catastrophe. She began to feel even more nervous, sensing how anxiety and insufficiency swelled her every second, even as the situation became increasingly tense. As if at that moment she felt screams behind her, which abruptly interrupted the silence in her head and reminded her of the terminology of the situation. Then the girl screamed as a majestic liana was flying, threatening to crowd away with its entwined tentacles, threatening with mortal danger. So, like a rhapto, this liana scattered into fragments, silently swelled, and disintegrated in the wind, depriving themselves of drinking. Sebla Malin, who having gone to trial before the trial, became aware that she would soon have to break the rules or betray people and prevent a catastrophe. After which she gave the order to urgently kill more and more people in the place, regardless of the risiki, even as the situation became more and more critical. Fred was amazed at her, his glance filled with doubts, and at the same time reasoning, and even at the same time understanding that in this situation it was Shvidko's fault, despite all the difficulties. At that very hour, he was praising Zeke greatly, even though he couldn't even begin to think that he could have a great time together, but he tried his best to reassure himself that everything would be fine with the other, although he wanted to understand the situation too careless. At that hour, the monster continued to mercilessly attack Zeke, its powerful paws and terrible tentacles delivering blows one after another. That Zeke, not caring about the danger, bravely rushed into battle, cutting the monster into small pieces, desperately trying to catch up with him. Zeke shouted loudly in anger, after which, having gathered all his strength, he began to attack the monster with incredible ferocity. He quickly began to cut the entire body of the monster, not giving him a good chance to survive. Judgment began to get even angrier at him, watching as Zik dealt with the monster. Zik cut open the entire body of the monster and began to fall to the bottom like a raptor. After that, he fell dumb and powerless, falling to the ground. Judging Don't Make Me Laugh, having washed Zik with a laugh, marveling at his powerlessness to stand on the ground. Judgment started to get even angrier and respected Zeke's behavior and made him look funny. Having guessed the moment when Zik was screaming heartily and fighting for his life, hoping to get a chance to rise to the top. After what, he guessed, raising his hand and burning. After that, vines came out of the ground, began to quickly rise, entwining everything in their path, and suddenly the stench rushed straight towards Zeke, trying to bury him in their snare. Zik, without hesitating, continued to protect himself with utmost care, cutting the vines one by one, trying not to let them pull him into his gluttonous embrace. She, having gathered all her will into a fist, declared that she would not be able to put pressure on anyone else. The judge was not surprised, even having long noted that Zik often loves to grumble at the ruin of his ambitions, saying that one day you will become the ruler of the heavens. And I was content to continue playing with him, but had long been tired of this game, which seemed more and more bad and senseless. After which, he waved his hand upward, and in the wind, silently behind the command, 2 great daggers appeared, hovering right above his head, ready for action. "Let's do another round." Having washed the judge, his voice sounded decisive and merciless. At that hour below, Dean was carefully tidying up the vines. At the same time, the unknown woman cleared the path to the exit, carefully clearing the vines and plumes that were about to crumble in the distance. The stinks brought people out all at once, trying to steal more of them than those who had stumbled into trouble. Fred continued to compliment Zeke, his heart beating faster with anxiety. Malin noted Fred's compliment, and smiling slightly said that she can go back with everything else herself. In her opinion, she is guilty of helping Zik, and even more important. Fred acknowledged how much she was grateful for the help she gave, and reinforced how important it was for him. After this, without fail, having destroyed it until the next, we hope to achieve the best possible outcome. Tim judged for an hour already singing, standing with one foot on Zika, preparing for the onset of the day. Fred hurried up to the new, rushing, silent wind, and was caught up in the wind. "Did you show up here to help your friend?" Having asked the judge, they brutalized Fred. After this, I slightly tilted my head and asked what I should do in such a situation. After this judgment, having washed it coldly, they began to threaten that Zik would die. That raptum, mute flash, the fierce court was penetrated by Fred's intense strength, filled with the energy of determination and overwhelming desire to steal his friend. After which Fred said with a shout, try to make her laugh, marveling at the judgment in her eyes, because she did not deprive her of everyday doubts. And after Frida looked at him with disbelief and thought that he might be crazy, he couldn't understand how it was possible to be so tight-lipped and smiley with such a dangerous person. Situations. After this trial, Mitya showed aggression and quickly began to attack him, trying to restore his strength or put Fred in his place. Fred stood up to repel the attacks, collapsing quickly and accurately, without any delay in planning ahead in order to avoid blows and preserve his position. But after Fred's hard blow at the trial, no trace was lost, after which Fred became focused and called out his strength, the light of memory, which filled him with energy and clarity. After which light swords began to fall from the sky, our planks, piercing the dark with their bright light, vibrating the skins from them, the silent chime of the mirror, and flying exactly on target, representing the power that Fred called to himself. That judge, having gathered all her will, cried out to the vines that grew from the ground and intertwined around him, creating a barrier, and the living vines began to protect him from the light skin attack. That Fred, not caring for the judge's protection, began to cut the vines with his sword. The skin blow was precise and forceful, the sword pierced the green vines, and the stinks fell to the ground, disintegrating into scraps. So when Fred broke through between the vines, a judge appeared in front of him, reaching for the sword, which was once again within his reach, his hand reaching out as quickly as possible. After which, the judge quickly grabbed Fred by the throat, squeezing his fingers, and began to cry. That, holding Frida by the throat, apparently bringing the daggers to his head, the cold metal blade glittered in the light, and his gaze was filled with courage, ready to deliver the remaining blow. After which, judging without hurting, hitting Fred in the back, piercing him with a knife with incredible force, the painful blow made Fred's muscles bend over in pain. Fred fell to the ground, his knees shaking in pain, and he was still on his feet, his body weakened by the impact. Judging by Fred's weakness, he was preparing for a major attack. And now come to your friend, having washed the judge, whose voice is calm and cold, silent death, as it is already approaching. That raptum judge having hit Zik with all the strength in life, snatching him from concentration. Tazik, with a serious expression of denunciation, declaring that he was not yet dead, Vin Mitevo collected the daggers of the judge, clenched them in his hands, and began to lamati, feeling the metal cracking under his force. Judging by looking at Zik with contempt, respecting him as a problematic child, he doesn't understand that the result will be the same, no matter how many times he attacks. With a smile at his accusations, he simply proclaims death, and that's all. Zeke, wriggling, kissing Fred's figure, having asked everything so much, but Fred, clenching his teeth and feeling pain, singing that everything is fine, trying not to see his weaknesses. It was not acceptable for Zika to know, but in his mind that he could not face the judge himself. Having looked at Fred, he had gathered all his courage, having tried to work at once, even if only they could overcome. Afterwards, the Stinks marveled one by one with a laugh, realizing that at once the Stinks could be healed if there was a step. Their eyes narrowed, and at that moment the vinyl between them was invisible, but there was a connection between the strength and mutual support. But quickly, as one force, they began to attack at once. Fred and Zik were angry in a single flow of ruins. Each blow was coordinated and precise, directed towards those in order to protect the judge and end the battle once and for all. Without giving up in judgment, with a cold look, Vin insisted that all their strengths were Marni, that they would never be able to overcome him, because Vin would be the strongest and the most knowledgeable. An incredibly strong beat began, in which the skin blow was heard in the wind, and the earth shook from the force of the attacks. The stench attacked one after another, the skin blow following the first one, creating a pressing, uninterrupted flow of force. Zeke, realizing how they are beginning to deprive them, calling on Fred not to give up, knowing that they are coming at once, they will not be able to reach the offensive stage, and even more so to heaven. Fred marveled at Zeke's words, not quite understanding why he began to call out so effortlessly before fighting. Fred was happy, and instead of being heisist and re-examining his power over the world, Zeke was trying to embrace him, not give up and fight at the same time. "Whoever said that I give up, I'm only starting," with a laugh, Fred said. Zeke knew the moment when the stench suddenly overpowered the monster, but Fred did not understand how much Zeke knew. It seemed to him that the situation was completely different, and the connection with this overcoming was not obvious to him. Zik guessed how the Stinks ended up in the same difficult situation earlier if they were in a bad situation, but could pass at once, believing that, regardless of the difficulties, if the Stinks would be at once, they could get over it anyway per Eshkoda. Fred guessed the moment when the stench overcame the monster, but he realized that they were simply spared. At that time, the stench had no other way out than to act at once and bet on luck. Having respected the fact that there is sometimes a need to take risks, we have not thought through all the possible outcomes, but instead move forward as one, because we understand that our struggle is not small for any other way out than action, stop, and go until the end. There was only one chance in them, and they couldn't miss it. It's clear that the skin of their hands could suddenly become great, and for an hour there is no more thought. Since the stink won't last at once, the chance could arise again, and they won't be able to correct their plans. After this stench, at once, without stopping, the Swedes began to attack the judge, unleashing their strength into a single, heavy thrashing. Having watched over them with great care, it was impossible to understand what they themselves were up to at the same time, and their appearance seemed to be related to the lack of food, and even their behavior seemed too unexplained and mysterious. After which the boys sharply scattered in different directions, creating a moment of confusion in the court, trying to follow the skin, and their inconsistency ruins, and the chaotic nature of getting lost. The situation was only getting worse. Judging by the fact that Zik is extremely gentle, his hands were almost invisible to the eye. Even though he was angry with too much of his stomach, he was frail due to skin problems. As he prepared to give the signal to Fred to attack, his eyes were straightened on the judge. He began to think about it, checking the ideal moment when the judge came up to give Fred the sign for the decisive blow. After that, Zik, not afraid of any of the militia, attacked the judge, whose ruins were so swift and decisive that the judge soon realized what was happening, first landing in the center of the crazy attack. "How are you laughing?" Having washed through the storm of judgment, his voice became harsh, and his appearance was filled with anger. But at this moment, Fred, having hastened the moment, began to attack the judge from the other side, creating a subversive onslaught. Apparently tripping on the pasta, the confusion appears on the skin of the rock, not reacting to the insult of the front at once. Alas, they laughed loudly, asking them not to think that this little trick was being played out, since they firmly believed in their strength and evidence and words that could tell them under the subordinate pressure. Strategy. That Fred, not respecting the words of the judge, met the moment when he was focused on Zika and quickly passed by with a most accurate strike. Judging by how Fred was able to withstand his attack, he did not experience such agility and maneuverability and wasted his concentration. Both sides had already attacked Zik, having speeded up the moment, when, judging by Fred's presence, his forces were mitten and merciless, and now, judging by being caught between two fronts, there was no chance of being hit by attacks from both sides. "Do you intend to attack me because of the pod?" I thought to myself, realizing how the situation was getting out of control. After that, they realized that the situation was getting out of control, calling on their strength, having collected all their reserves. That Zik, with singing in his voice, having said that it was all too late and everything was over for the court, his words sounded like a virok, and with all the force he was trying to mobilize, it was clear that the chances of the court to win quickly fade away. After which the stench hit him at once. In one blast, the blow was incredibly strong and accurate, the combined strength and mastery of both. Judging by being in the shot, not believing what they finally got away with, he could not believe that his unbreakable defense was maligned and that he recognized the defeats. Having fallen to the ground, defeated by battle, and simply muttering, his body was in ruins, and his mind, it seemed, could not process everything that had happened. The competitors were glad that everything was over. They felt relieved, and even the long and intense struggle had reached its conclusion. They could not believe that they had managed to overcome Fissy, but it seemed incredible, and even a few weeks later, their situation was hopeless. But at that hour, the Stinks were glad that they could survive, and even though the situation was so tense that their skin could become fatal, anxiety and relief mixed in their hearts, but they knew that the beginning of a new battle. The unknown woman praised them, even though it was clear in them that recognition shone in her eyes, and even she knew what they had gone through and how they fought with determination to the end. after which the stinks raised their heads to the mountain and opened the open portal into which the other contestants flew. The bright light that came out of the portal illuminated the middle of everything, and the stinks realized that this is the coming deadline. Physis lay unconscious, his body was inviolate, and his face was empty. Zika and Fred were glad that everything had come out in them. They marveled one by one with chuckles at their faces, feeling incredibly relieved after an important battle. As other contestants began to rush before them, their faces reflected the madness and joy of the trials they had experienced. The stinks sang to them, blaming their longevity for the encouragement. The stench began to blow them up into the mountains, celebrating the holidays like little heroes. That unknown woman and Dean were interrupted by their joy, rapidly approaching Zik and Fred and taking them away. The stinks took them away with words that were already busy and they needed to go. That Zik was indignant, even without realizing how fast he was, even at this moment in his life. "Everyone except us has already risen up," said the unknown woman, her voice sounding calm, but with a hint of terminology. Zik said goodbye to everyone and rushed up to them with a laugh and words, "What a stink." They needed to hurry, because the portal would soon close. It was time for exchanges, and everything would be important. "We are already close," with a laugh at Fred's accusation, hearing how the praise is gradually changing to singing. The stinks flew to the mountain, and the skins from them felt how the heart beats with emotion. They left behind the important battle and approached new opportunities. This time, Physis was simply lying on the ground. After that, Francis stood up, his body still shaking with pain and anger. Chaotic thoughts intertwined in his head, and at the moment when he tried to turn to reality, his eyes became nervous. Anger resurfaced. He couldn't just let them go. After which, Physis regained her strength, and her great hand began to reach out to them. She collapsed with incredible speed. "Is he still alive?" Zik said in shock, not believing his eyes. Having decided to completely defend the heavenly gates, whose eyes are burning with determination, knowing that they are destroyed, those who, having already lost themselves in this world, will not be able to flow in or find a new one, we walked to the offensive level. It was even richer, and even though the stinks were already there, you could stand between them and you could feel the gates, and your skin would be important. The smells began to panic, and it was even more dangerous, hovering in front of their eyes for an hour, and their hearts were beating more and more with the knowledge that any delay could lead to a catastrophe. Zik thought about those who at that moment, if he was angry, he felt a wonderful surge of strength. It was like the energy that burst from his center, no skin blow, and his skin became swishing, stronger. At this moment, Zik turned around and flew back, feeling how the skin cells of his body were filled with new energy. After that, Zik, having collected all his courage, asked to take the price off of the new one, knowing that it would be important, but his stubbornness and newfound power gave him a sense of remorse. After which Zik flew straight into the monster's hand, realizing how his skin's touch became precise and decisive. Though he didn't understand how to get back with that force that was in the new one at once, Zik sensed how there was an invisible whirlwind bubbling up in the new one, ready to tear everything apart. Zik understands that if he concentrates all the energy in his hand, he can fight with this force. After this, Zik, having collected all his energy and focused it in his hand, began to attack, rushing with extreme fluidity and force, perceiving how his skin's blow became accurate and forceful. Although Zik understands that the physis is seriously adjusting, he cannot hesitate. Zik also didn't want to give up. Regardless of the fact that Physis was a terrible rival and seriously trained, Zik realized that this was his moment. And the one who has the most singing, the one who will win in that battle. After that, Zik, having collected all his strength and inner strength, began to attack Physis with his dragon power. Having begun to obliterate the monster's hand with dragon power, he felt how the energy of Physis gradually penetrated into him. Seeing the sick man, he couldn't believe that Zik was in a position to control such incredible power. After which the dragon, consuming all its strength in one labored splash, has lost the monster Physis. "I'm gonna go. Be kind to people," Zik said goodbye with a laugh in his face. The judges and Malin marveled at him, and in the eyes of the judge there was a sense of wonder and insanity. Malin said in parting, so that the stench did not break the rules, but her words were calm, but there was a song of anxiety in them, as if she were praising for her distant fate. After which the stinks immediately flew into the portal, leaving behind all the difficulties and battles, and fell heavily onto the next floor. The axis and everything, everyone flew away, having died, having washed the judge, their voice sounding important, dumb, while simultaneously experiencing a feeling of relief and loss. Alas, I don't understand why I was so desperately trying to entice them to climb to the next floor. As a judge, they demanded to convert one of the applicants without actually choosing anyone, eliminating them until the rest. They didn't know about their burning hatred, they didn't want to let them go, they sensed an internal discord that they couldn't control. And the Axis, knowing that they could not be pushed in, was still patient, and the struggle in the middle was strong for the current situation. Once we know that people are rising more, we are more aware of how thirsty this world is, a new stage, a new level of not just testing, but also the revelation of cruel truths, like it's impossible to get lost. The more you fall into the situation, and it was the same with everyone else, based on everything that is observed with the participants. The understanding that the skin of the mountain picks up a piece of hope, breaks illusions about justice and the ability to change this world. After which you laughed and guessed Zika. Having guessed the words about those who will go to heaven, I began to wonder that another world might be amazed, which is already 500 years dead. After which Malin chuckled. Why Fissy behaved like this, without judging anything, she was stuck in his behavior, even though it was streamed and cold, and at the same time his emotions were too bright. It is not your fault to protect Ikar with a calm face, to convey through it is a pity, and that this image suits everyone. After these words, people began to approach, their looks were mixed. The men of them marveled at the trial from behind the walls, guarding behind his skin, their eyes were wary, slightly protective. A little girl came up with tears in her eyes and 3,000 in her hands and asked him to stop. The girl marveled at him right in the eyes, and her voice became quieter and even more solemn, and she asked to turn the judge they knew. Fisas, realizing how the words struck him deeply, lowered his head, searching for strength in himself to get away from everything that happened. Everything is good. It's time to put things in order, Malin said with a chuckle. At that hour, Zeke, together with the others, stepped up to step on top, sensing how the atmosphere around them was changing. Their skin seemed important, and even they knew that even more experiments awaited them, and then new possibilities. Zika was 300 years old when the Stinks were about to leave, but at that hour, I was glad that the Stinks were approaching the surface. So in such a short hour, Zik experienced so many things that it was important to realize how quickly everything was changing. So Zik understands that during this hour he experienced a lot of bright moments, but there were some unpleasantnesses. Trying out what Stinks were encountered was far from easy. And if it weren't for you, I wouldn't have been able to get away with all this, Fred said with a laugh. Zik listened to everything Fred said, and also agreed for everything. Dean felt sick, and even the fact that Zik felt so old in such a way made him sick. The unknown woman marveled at Zik and chuckled, noting how he had changed, no longer being the same lad as he had grown up, becoming more mellow in himself and more visible. And immediately Zik put it on his shoulder, looking amazing. This is a heavenly symbol, a sign, which was previously heard of in stories and legends. The heavenly symbol that appeared on Zik's shoulder was actually part of an ancient tradition, which conveyed that wine is given to those applicants who have successfully passed all the tests and are appointed to the judge. This symbol is important, and if the stench did not take them away, the stench could not pass to another level. The stench took away the benefit of only one judge, but this did not mean that their journey was completed. There were as many as 9 rivals, and the skins from them, putting new tests in front of them, the stench passed only the first raven. Now with the removed symbols, you will have to go through new tests determined by other judges. Even if you move to another level without losing your mind, you will be punished. We were both in trouble, and we forcibly broke through, starting to make Zeke nervous. Fred, noticing how Zeke began to panic, tried to calm him down, and even tried the trial was soon to smell the fruit and the stench of his vicanali. Zeke became thoughtful after Fred's words. Alvin quickly calmed down. The fragments in them have their own symbol, and so there would be a lot of need for food. She, being very motivated and full of courage, said that the Stinks would fly much faster, without wasting time. But at this moment, if I became concerned about the situation, a dance flew straight at me. He became angry, and could not comprehend. The stars flew to the memory of what had sunk into him so unwillingly. When Zik turned around, he began to laugh, as behind him there were numerous whirlwinds that were spinning in a chaotic dance. The stench must have burst through the whirlwinds, and this has put a tremendous amount of stress on them. Even if the skin collapses have become extreme, everyone could sense that anxiety was growing, since there was no way to get through without the stench. Ushkogen through such a spontaneous transition. Don't be afraid, even if it's just a little bitch. having washed away Dina's motivations, trying to calm everyone down. After which the stinks kicked up in the very center of the tuft, and the strong wind began to drown them. Without blowing away, they began to scream loudly, begging for help. Dean, as a result, had the gift of language, standing still and not being able to speak any words. After that, without showing any tension, with nervous tremors in his voice, he asked to turn back. That Zeke, not daring to give up, tried with all his might to overcome the fear and collapse forward. But Dean, without faltering, said that if he wanted to die, let him go alone. That's why Zeke, not dying of respect for Dean's words, grabbed his hand, tightly squeezing it, and not giving him the opportunity to step up, starting to pull him behind him. Fred and the unknown woman began to follow them up the mountain, not caring about the importance and concern that was in front. Even though the wind was much stronger, they thought, it was tearing through their bodies, shaking them to the point of wasting their strength, their skin breaking with great difficulties. That Fred shouted so that the stench would disappear at once, and even if only their strength had been combined, the stench could climb the mountain, and his voice, even if it was in the wind, would become more decisive. Having sensed the word and having waited, we realized that without support, the stench alone would not be able to overcome this element. And then Raptovo, a majestic cowlick, appeared right in front of him. "Be careful!" Loudly ahead of Fred, his words made their way through the roar of the cowlick. Zik pulled out his glove, tightly clenched it in his hand, and prepared to defend himself. After which Zik began to forcefully fight out of the cowlick, vigorously waving his glove, trying to dissipate the cowlick. After which Zik collected all his energy and began to prepare to strike again. But they didn't understand why Zik should ask, and doubts clouded their thoughts. That power of Zik spread through the vortex, creating sparks and flames that seemed almost invisible against the backdrop of the wild elements. "Bachili?" Having chanted Zik with his praises, his voice began to sing. They didn't believe that it was working effectively. Everyone stood dumbfounded, not believing their eyes, when the cowlick began to bloom and appeared calm before them. And then the wind began to grow again, not having been able to ignore Zika's handout, and the wind began to roar again. Not only that, having turned around, but having also become richer, the cowlick had already increased its tightness and was filled with even more destructive energy. Al-Zik tried to calm everyone down, pretending that it was only a force of nature and no one was to blame. After the whirlwind began to see them in the middle, and the strong gusts of wind blew them from all sides, the stinks began to soak in, but the strong flow of the wind again may have dulled them. They began to spin around in the wind, and the stench could be heard as they were drawn upward towards the mountain. The whirl was extremely strong, and Zika began to twist the whirl to the very end, having realized how his body was manipulating in chaotic Russia without any possibility of getting stuck. Afterwards, together with the penguin, he simply threw himself into the forest, and the stinks fell among the dark trees, where silence and uncertainty permeated them. After this, the stench fell to the ground with great force, feeling how a skin blow on the ground penetrated through their bodies, eliminating pain. But at the same time, the stench rejoiced at the fact that they were lost alive, although they could not quite awaken to the fear and insignificance that was burying them. After the stench began to become noticeable, the stench itself became drunk, and the middle part, which seemed absolutely mysterious to them, was ruined. Behind the trees, the stench marked someone, a figure who had unexpectedly appeared in this wild place, and excitement mixed with anxiety. But the stench could not understand who it was. The fragments of the figure disappeared in the shade of the trees, and they were in disguise, which only emphasized their innocence and fear. Behind the tree stood a small and squealing girl. Her eyes were full of fear, and her hands were shaking. Zik greeted her, hoping to be friends, but the girl sang at his voice and scurried behind the tree, looking at him from under the stems of the trees with an expression of disbelief and fear. Zik boozed Divovani that she was involved, even if he didn't mean to clack Yi. Pro-Penguin didn't Izduvi, even denouncing Zik Yogi Inkoli clacked. These words made Zika angry, even realizing that his guise was entirely suitable for a person who fell to earth from the heavens, and that his appearance could have added to the mystery of the situation and not evoked fear. Immediately, he raised his injured hand, and the girl's eyes lit up at this, and a sadness appeared in their gaze, which replaced anxiety. After that, without staring at my wounded hands, she tissed that everything was fine, trying to understand, and not recognizing any serious injuries. She also noticed that they were badly hurt, and her heart sank with rage, and at the same time she was sad. That Zeke, having noted the whole thing after all, if he had shown respect for his wounds, he did not understand how serious the stench was. After that, he just started screaming loudly, not in a way of streamlining the emotions that had accumulated, but disappointment and destruction burst out into the open, and he saw his voice in the forest. I'm silent for a moment. After that, she quickly approached the next one, without forgetting about her anxiety. She walked up to the new place with a laugh at her face, trying to look calm, and took out her hands from her bag. Her hands were singing, otherwise she had already encountered such situations more than once, and I began to carefully clean up his wounds in order to change the amount. Be patient for 3 minutes, she chanted, marveling at the tenderness in her eyes. After that, she began to heal him, carefully applying bandages to the wounds and rubbing them with her hands. Her hands collapsed quickly and accurately, and she was exposing her to the grave. The sky was completely covered with it, to help you, Yaknaishvidshi. But there was no trace of the wound that was shaking them both. They marveled at the place, where there was still shelter, and they couldn't believe their eyes. The wound burned so quickly, otherwise there would have been no injury. These words pleased her, and a slight smile appeared on her face. She realized that her help had really brought results, and it gave her hope that everything might not be as bad as it seemed. After she began to boast that she was the best doctor in the kingdom of labor, they laughed with pride. Her voice became full of self-satisfaction, and she paused, looking out for buried or unearthed from Zika for his time. She began to ask why the stinks, amazed at them, as if the stinks were injured, as if there was nothing wrong here. We were thrown into a whirlwind, having watched Zik calmly, trying to explain, although the words sounded wonderful, a sign for the new one. After which, Zik began to tell the whole story, how the stinks settled here, describing in detail how they were caught in a cowlick, which took them from the first one on top and transferred them from this unknown forest to another. That's how we arrived. Having watched Zik, we finished our conversation. After which the stench descended on the crossroads of roads, hoping that this place would help them know the way forward. Zika tutted as the others got here, and all was well with them, and the penguin didn't flinch, as if the stinks had collapsed back into Icarus on top. The girl first looked especially at the applicant, and she was delighted. But she was still eagerly ahead of them, so that the stench would be protected, and even though everything looked calm, there was a lot of trouble here. That Zik calmed her down, singing in her strength, and even she healed him, and she believes that we can turn back with all the benefits that look ahead. After which Zik noticed that his hand was sore. He marveled at it in amazement, feeling how he would gradually pretend that his hand was much larger for its extreme size, and this made him tired to worry, because the healing, as I had sensed earlier, was no longer a laughing matter. She kissed her hand, and the girl confirmed that this was a side effect of the treatment. She explained that sometimes after such quick healings, a problem can arise, and what time is it? After which the girl began to run, quickly appearing in the middle of the trees. Before she came into view, she got out of sight and calmed down, promising that everything would soon come to order. After that, she ran into the forest, surrounded by dense trees, and Zik kept watch over her swift hands. Then, behind him, Zik sensed booming sounds that abruptly shattered the silence, sounding like the cracking of trees or croaks that were approaching. "Stop the witch!" The faces began to shout as they ran towards Zik. The stench ran past him, not dying of respect, and raced far to that girl. Zik could not understand that the faces were supposed to be oriented towards him. Rap changed direction and chased after her. Toddy Zik understands why his hand has become like this, and is not just a side effect of the treatment. The stench was seriously trained to catch them. The faces fled with such determination that Zik understood, not just reinvestigation, but what was more important for them. After which the faces began to attack them, trying to drive them into the pasture. The stinks collapsed synchronously, carefully selecting moments for strikes, trying to quickly disappear. The stench drained away, and no longer able to escape, it fell to the ground, its eyes filled with fear. After which one of the faces grabbed her by the hair, pulling her towards him, and she began to scream for help, and I heard her voice screaming. Zik Movchki marveled at this, and did not understand what was happening. His mind could not catch up with the steps that had flared up in front of him. The whole situation was completely confused, and he could not understand why the girl reacts in such a way that the faces follow her. The stinks continued to chew on her hair, aggressively pressing on her, and her cries for help became louder and louder. Zik did not dare to be surprised at this, but quickly ran up, going over the hand of the person who was trimming the girl. "Who are you, and how dare you respect the order of the ranks? Having washed your face, you look at Zika with anger and unwelcome unimportance." Zik explained that he was overcome by those who attacked the child. His voice was firm and decisive. The person was amazed that this little guy had emerged so strong, and looked at Zik, trying to understand as much as possible. After which Zik kissed the girl. What's her name? He turned around to her, still putting up his defenses. His gaze was respectful, and his hands were swift and decisive. "Stella." The girl shed tears in her eyes. Her voice was slightly trembling. After that, Zik hid his stronger person who was trying to get closer, not giving any chance to escape. The person guaranteed that Zik's strength and resolve were invincible. With all his strength, Zik turned him over to the ground, and the face landed with a dull thud which seemed to have disappeared from the silence. It was quite shocking to all those present that the people who had been in power and control for so many years now stood implicated, not knowing how to react. "After that," Zik said, marveling at her, who needed to flow, as she did not want them to disappear, whose voice was firm and decisive, knowing that now there was only one chance for her. She must flow in while the faces were still in shots about what happened. Even though the girl was already praising him for him, her eyes were full of anxiety, and her heart was clenched with fear, and she could not comprehend that everything would be good, even if she were in trouble. Zik calmed her down, having told her that everything would be fine with him, and she didn't boast too much, marveling at her eyes, trying to convey all her sweetness. Vona listened to him with tears in his eyes and ran away from the stars, and from the skin of his mouth to share important experiences, but she knew that she had to go and hide. The kings began to scream, ruined and disunited, and even did not understand who Zik was, who so fiercely resisted them, as if they were obeying the king's order. They could not understand what connected him with this. A girl, and why does he so decisively protect her? Zik began to sing, saying that nothing connects him with the girl except for the duty to work correctly. His voice was firm, even if, and determination shone in his eyes. That Zik, having realized his past, degraded his little one, making him feel like a powerless victim. As she flowed past them, simply enjoying herself in it, in her eyes, and with the same hopelessness and fear that she had seen herself, she was just as small, spilling, and like her, she was "I am tired of fighting the cruelty of this world." After that, Zik prepared before the attack, having collected all his resolve and concentration, realizing that he could not allow the people to kill him. "You're pissing me off!" Zik began to shout, his voice sounding with anger. After which Zik attacked them with his wild cry. Those two faces lay on the ground, exhausted and powerless. Their airbags rang as the stench fell, and the silence was deafening. Zik stood in front of them. They were so important, and their hearts beat faster. In the fog created by the blow, standing alone, his face seemed like a primal space, shrouded in a dark veil, which was enveloping him in death. Without his eyes, which shone with cold light. Having marveled in this direction and not understanding what was expected, one's mind was doubtful and nutritional, and everything that was expected. This personage respected the fact that filthy children are guilty of punishment, and whose voice sounded firm and cold, like ice, speaking without any emotion, mute because of his obligations, not doubting the rightness of his DIY. After which the face hit him with his sword at the shoulder. Zik felt how cold steel penetrated his body and almost spread across his entire body. Zika, having absorbed this blow, and having felt how a sharp pain pierced his shoulder, shook him and began to move. After this blow, the face was wounded. He did not realize that Zik was withstanding such an attack, and began to wonder that this small one could emerge stronger, without thinking. Even the face of the chanting of depriving him of one hand, he realized that after such a strong blow, Zik would not be able to continue the fight, that his hand would be useless. That Zik was struggling with all his strength, but his shoulder was throbbing because of the injury, but he could not allow himself to fall. It was not safe. I missed the moment of the attack, Zik thought to himself, realizing that his underestimation of the situation could have cost me more than just injury. At that very moment Zik was celebrating, when the person actively thinking about what this incident was about, he could not believe that the opponent was singing. After which Zik, unimportant at all, said with a grin, "Try again," his voice sounding firm, and there was a stubborn look in his eyes. Al-Face, taking into account that everything was arrogant, smiled disrespectfully, changing that Zik, despite his determination, still could not withstand another blow. It was clear that Zik could now evade the offensive attack. The Face was preparing for a new blow, not caring for those who had already suffered from Zik's vitriol. After this, Zik suddenly jumped out of control and came out of the field of view of Zik, depriving him of further damage and recovery. Zik tried to get his bearings, but could not comprehend anything. Zika was overcome with nervousness and began to restlessly walk back and forth, trying to understand what was going on. His mind was clouded, and his heart was beating faster. After hearing this, his body became extremely heavy, and he was being weighed down by an invisible weight. His skin was becoming more and more important, and it became important to die because the whole world was tightening around him. Squeezing. I was just tired of those who were steadily withering away from attacks, Zik thought to himself, feeling how the pain ached from the constant stress. Clenching my teeth, trying to push myself through the piercing pain and unbearable heaviness that covered my whole body. My skin was overcome with great difficulties, but without giving free rein to the pain, maintaining control and firmness spirit, if Yogo strength has been exhausted.